This is Tammie with Empowered Beyond Belief, and it is my job to empower you. A Wanderer in the Spirit Lands by Franchezzo, transcribed by Farnese. O star of hope that shines to bless the wanderer through life's wilderness, angels of love, say, are ye come to lead the weary wanderer home? Introductions. Preface by the transcriber. The following narrative was written more than a year ago, and, in giving it to the public, I do not claim to be its author, since I have only acted the part of an amanuensis and endeavored to write down as truthfully and as carefully as I could the words given to me by the spirit author himself, who is one of several spirits who have desired me to write down for them their experiences in the spirit world. I have had to write the words as fast as my pen could travel over the paper, and many of the experiences described and opinions advanced are quite contrary to what I myself believed to be in accordance with the conditions of life in the world of spirits. The spirit author Franchezzo I have frequently seen materialized, and he has been recognized on these occasions by friends who knew him in earth life. Having given the narrative to the public as I received it from the spirit author, I must leave him with all the responsibility for the opinions expressed and the scenes described. A. Farnese, London, 1896. Dedication by the author. To those who still toil in the mists and darkness of uncertainty which veil the future of their earthly lives, I dedicate this record of the wanderings of one who has passed from earth life into the hidden mysteries of the life beyond, in the hope that through my experiences now given to the world, some may be induced to pause in their downward career and think ere they pass from the mortal life as I did, with all their unrepented sins thick upon them. It is to those of my brethren who are treading fast upon the downward path that I would fain hope to speak with the power which truth ever has over those who do not blindly seek to shut it out. For if the after consequences of a life spent in dissipation and selfishness are often terrible even during the earth life, they are doubly so in the spirit world, where all disguise is stripped from the soul, and it stands forth in all the naked hideousness of its sins, with the scars of the spiritual disease contracted in its earthly life, stamped upon its spirit form, never to be effaced, but by the healing powers of sincere repentance and the cleansing waters of its own sorrowful tears. I now ask these dwellers upon earth to believe that if these weary travelers of the other life can return to warn their brothers yet on earth, they are eager to do so. I would have them to understand that spirits who materialize have a higher mission to perform than even the solacing of those who mourn in deep affliction for the beloved they have lost. I would have them look and see that now, even at the 11th hour of man's pride and sin, these spirit wanderers are permitted by the Great Supreme to go back and tell them the fate of all who outrage the laws of God and man. I would have even the idle and frivolous to pause and think whether spiritualism be not something higher, holier, nobler, than the passing of an idle hour in speculations as to whether there are occult forces which can move a table or rap out the alphabet, and whether it is not possible that these feeble raps and apparently unmeaning tips and tilts of a table are but the opening doors through which a flood of light is being let in upon the dark places of earth and the netherworld, faint signs that those who have gone before do now return to earth to warn their brethren. As a warrior who has fought and conquered, I look back upon the scenes of those battles and the toils through which I have passed, and I feel that all has been cheaply won, all has been gained for which I hoped and strove, and I seek now but to point out the better way to others who are yet in the storm and stress of battle, that they may use the invaluable time given to them upon earth to enter upon and follow with unfaltering step the shining path which shall lead them home to rest and peace at last. Franchezzo. Part 1. Days of Darkness. Chapter 1. My Death. I have been a wanderer through a far country, in those lands that have no name, no place, for you of earth, and I would set down as briefly as I can my wanderings, that those whose feet are pointed to that bourne may know what may, in their turn, await them. On earth and in my life of earth, I lived as those do who seek only how the highest point of the self-gratification can be reached. If I was not unkind to some, if I was indulgent to those I loved, yet it was ever with the feeling that they in return must minister to my gratification, that from them I might purchase by my gifts and my affection the love and homage which was as my life to me. I was talented, highly gifted both in mind and person, and from my earliest years the praise of others was ever given to me, and was ever my sweetest incense. No thought ever came to me of that all self-sacrificing love which can sink itself so completely in the love for others that there is no thought, no hope of happiness, but in securing the happiness of the beloved ones. In all my life, and amongst those women whom I loved, as men of earth, too often miscall that which is but a passion too low and base to be dignified by the name of love. Amongst all those women who from time to time captivated my fancy, there was not one who ever appealed to my higher nature sufficiently to make me feel this was true love, this is the ideal for which in secret I sighed. In everyone I found something to disappoint me. They loved me as I loved them, no more, no less. The passion I gave won but its counterpart from them, and thus I passed on, unsatisfied, longing for I knew not what. Mistakes I made, ah, how many! Sins committed, not a few, yet the world was often at my feet to praise me and call me good and noble and gifted. I was feted, caressed, the spoilt darling of dames of fashion. I had to woo to win, and when I won, all turned to bitter ashes in my teeth. And then there came a time upon which I shall not dwell, when I made the most fatal mistake of all, and spoilt 2 lives where I had wrecked but one before. It was not a golden flowery wreath of roses that I wore, but a bitter chain, fetters as of iron that galled and bruised me, till at last I snapped them asunder and walked forth free. Free? Ah, me! Never again should I be free, for never for one moment can our past errors and mistakes cease to dog our footsteps and clog our wings while we live, aye, and after the life of the body is ended, till one by one we have atoned for them, and thus blotted them from our past. And then it was, when I deemed myself secure from all love, when I thought I had learned that love could teach, knew all women had to give, that I met one woman. Ah, what shall I call her? She was more than a mortal woman in my eyes, and I called her the good angel of my life. And from the first moment that I knew her, I bowed down at her feet and gave her all the love of my soul, of my higher self, a love that was poor and selfish when compared to what it should have been, but it was all I had to give, and I gave it all. For the first time in my life, I thought of another more than of myself, and though I could not rise to pure thoughts, the bright fancies that filled her soul, I thank God I never yielded to the temptation to drag her down to me. As so time went on, I sunned myself in her sweet presence. I grew in holy thoughts that I deemed had left me forever. I dreamed sweet dreams in which I was freed from those chains to my past that held me so cruelly, so hardly, now when I sought for better things. And from my dreams I ever woke to the fear that another might win her from me, and to the knowledge that I, alas, had not the right to say one word to hold her back. Ah, me! The bitterness and the suffering of those days, I knew it was myself alone who had built that wall between us. I felt that I was not fit to touch her, soiled as I was in the world's ways. How could I dare to take that innocent, pure life and link it to my own? At times, hope would whisper it might be so, but reason said, no. And though she was so kind, so tender to me, that I read the innocent secret of her love, I felt that on earth she never would be mine. Her purity and her truth raised between us a barrier I could never pass. I tried to leave her. In vain. As a magnet is drawn to the pole, so was I ever drawn back to her, till at last I struggled no more. I strove only to enjoy the happiness that her presence gave, happy that at least the pleasure and the sunshine of her presence was not denied me. And then, then there came for me an awful and unexpected day, when, with no warning, no sign to awaken me to my position, I was suddenly snatched from life and plunged into that gulf, that death of the body which awaits us all. And I knew not that I had died. I passed from some hours of suffering and agony into sleep, deep, dreamless sleep, and when I awoke, it was to find myself alone in total darkness. I could rise, I could move, surely I was better, but where was I? Why this darkness? Why was no light left within me? I arose and groped, as one does in a dark room, but I could find no light, hear no sound. There was nothing but the stillness, the darkness of death around me. Then I thought I would walk forward and find the door. I could move, though slowly and feebly, and I groped on, for how long I know not. It seemed hours, for in my growing horror and dismay I felt I must find some way out of this place, and to my despair I seemed never to find any door, any wall, anything. All seemed space and darkness round me. Overcome at last, I called out loud. I shrieked, and no voice answered me. Then again and again I called, and still the silence, still no echo, even from my own voice, came back to cheer me. I bethought me of her I loved, but something made me shrink from uttering her name there. Then I thought of all the friends I had known, and I called on them, but none answered me. Was I in prison? No, a prison has walls, and this place had none. Was I mad? Delirious? What? I could feel myself, my body. It was the same, surely the same. No features, when I passed my hand over them, seemed larger, coarser, distorted, surely. Oh, for a light! Oh, for anything to tell me even the worst that could be told! Would no one come? Was I quite alone? And she, my angel of light, oh, where was she? Before my sleep she had been with me. Where was she now? Something seemed to snap in my brain and in my throat, and I called wildly to her by name, to come to me, if but for once more. I felt a terrible sense as if I had lost her, and I called and called to her wildly, and for the first time my voice had a sound and rang back to me through that awful darkness. Before me, far, far away, came a tiny speck of light like a star that grew and came nearer and nearer, till at last it appeared before me as a large ball of light, in shape like a star, and in the star I saw my beloved. Her eyes were closed, as of one in sleep, but her arms were held out to me, and her gentle voice said in those tones I knew so well, "Oh, my love, where are you now? I cannot see you. I only hear your voice. I only hear you call to me, and my soul answers to yours." I tried to rush to her, but I could not. Some invisible force held me back, and around her seemed a ring I could not pass through. In agony I sank to the ground, calling upon her to leave me no more. Then she seemed to grow unconscious. Her head sank upon her breast, and I saw her float away from me, as though some strong arms had borne her. I sought to rise and follow her, but I could not. It was as if a great chain held me fast, and after some fruitless struggle, I sank upon the ground in unconsciousness. When I awoke again, I was overjoyed to see that my beloved one had returned to me. She was standing near, looking this time as I had seen her on earth, but pale and sad, and all dressed in black. The star was gone, and all around was darkness, yet not utter darkness, since around her was a pale, faint glow of light, by which I could see she carried flowers, white flowers, in her hands. She stooped over a long, low mound of fresh earth. I drew nearer and saw that she was silently weeping. As she laid down the flowers on that low mound, her voice murmured softly, "Oh, my love, oh, my love, will you never come back to me? Can you be indeed dead and gone, where my love cannot follow you, where you can hear my voice no more? My love, oh, my dear love." She was kneeling down now, and I drew near, very near, though I could not touch her, and as I knelt down, I, too, looked at that long, low mound. A shock of horror passed over me, for I knew now, at last, that I was dead, and this was my own grave. Chapter 2. Despair. "Dead? Dead!" I wildly cried. "Oh, no, surely no, for the dead feel nothing more. They turn to dust, they molder, to decay, and all is gone, all is lost to them. They have no more consciousness of anything, unless, indeed, my boasted philosophy of life has been all wrong, all false, and the soul of the dead still lives, even though the body decays. The priests of my own church had taught me so, but I had scorned them as fools, blind and knavish, who for their own ends taught that men lived again and could only get to heaven through a gate of which they held the keys, keys that turned only for gold, and at the bidding of those who were paid to say masses for the departed soul, priests who made dupes of silly, frightened women and weak-minded men, who, yielding to the terror inspired by their awful tales of hell and purgatory, gave themselves bodies and souls to purchase the elusive privilege they promised. I would have none of them. My knowledge of these priests and the inner hidden lives of many of them had been too great for me to listen to their idle tales, their empty promises of a pardon they could not give, and I had said I would face death when it came, with the courage of those who know only that for them it must mean total extinction. For if these priests were wrong, who was right? Who could tell us anything of the future, or if there were any God at all? Not the living, for they but theorize and guess, and not the dead, for none came back from them to tell. And now I stood beside this grave, my own grave, and heard my beloved call me dead and strew flowers upon it. As I looked, the solid mound grew transparent before my eyes, and I saw down to the coffin with my own name and the date of my death upon it. And through the coffin I saw the white, still form I knew as myself lying within. I saw to my horror that this body had already begun to decay and become a loathsome thing to look upon. Its beauty was gone, its features none would recognize, and I stood there, conscious, looking down upon it and then at myself. I felt each limb traced out with my hands, each familiar feature of my face, and knew I was dead, and yet I lived. If this were death, then those priests must have been right after all. The dead lived, but where? In what state? Was this darkness hell? For me, they would have found no other place. I was so lost, so beyond the pale of their church, that for me they would not have found a place even in purgatory. I had cast off all ties to their church. I had so scorned it, deeming that a church which knew of and yet tolerated the shameful and ambitious lives of many of its most honored dignitaries had no claim to call itself a spiritual guide for anyone. There were good men in the church, true, but there was also this mass of shameless evil ones whose lives were common talk, common matter of ridicule, yet the church that claimed to be the example to all men and hold all truth did not cast out these men of disgraceful lives. No, she advanced them to higher posts of honor. None who have lived in my native land and seen the terrible abuses of power in her church will wonder that a nation should rise and seek to cast off such a yoke. Those who can recall the social and political condition of Italy in the earlier half of this century, and the part the Church of Rome played in helping the oppressor to rivet the fetters with which she was bound, and who know how her domestic life was honeycombed with spies, priests as well as laymen, till a man feared to whisper his true sentiments to his nearest and dearest, lest she should betray him to the priest, and he again to the government. How the dungeons were crowded with unhappy men, yea, even with mere lads guilty of no crime, save love of their native land and hatred of its oppressors. Those, I say, who know all this, will not wonder at the fierce indignation and burning passion which smoldered in the breasts of Italia's sons, and burst at last into a conflagration which consumed man's faith in God and in his so-called vicar upon earth, and like a mountain torrent that has burst its bounds, swept away men's hopes of immortality, if only through submission to the decrees of the Church it was to be obtained. Such, then, had been my attitude of revolt and scorn towards the Church in which I had been baptized, and that Church could have no place within her pale for me. If her anathemas could send a soul to hell, surely I must be there. And yet, as I thought thus, I looked again upon my beloved, and I thought she could never have come to hell, even to look for me. She seemed mortal enough, and if she knelt by my grave, surely I must still be upon earth. Did the dead then never leave the earth at all, but hover near the scenes of their earthly lives? With such and many similar thoughts crowding through my brain, I strove to get nearer to her I so loved, but found I could not. An invisible barrier seemed to surround her and keep me back. I could move on either side of her as I pleased, nearer or farther, but her I could not touch. Vain were all my efforts. Then I spoke. I called to her by name. I told her that I was there, that I was still conscious, still the same, though I was dead. And she never seemed to hear. She never saw me. She still wept sadly and silently, still tenderly touched the flowers, murmuring to herself that I had so loved flowers, surely I would know that she had put them there for me. Again and again I spoke to her as loudly as I could, but she heard me not. She was deaf to my voice. She only moved uneasily and passed her hand over her head as one in a dream, and then slowly and sadly she went away. I strove with all my might to follow her. In vain. I could go but a few yards from the grave and my earthly body, and then I saw why. A chain as of dark silk thread seemed no thicker than a spider's web held me to my body. No power of mine could break it. As I moved, it stretched like elastic, but always drew me back again. Worst of all, I began now to be conscious of feeling the corruption of that decaying body affecting my spirit, as a limb that has become poisoned affects with suffering the whole body on earth, and a fresh horror filled my soul. Then a voice, as of some majestic being, spoke to me in the darkness and said, "You loved that body more than your soul. Watch it now as it turns to dust, and know what it was that you worshipped, and ministered, and clung to. Know how perishable it was, how vile it has become, and look upon your spirit body and see how you have starved and cramped and neglected it for the sake of the enjoyments of the earthly body. Behold, how poor and repulsive and deformed your earthly life has made your soul, which is immortal and divine and to endure forever." And I looked and beheld myself. As in a mirror held up before me, I saw myself. Oh, horror! It was beyond doubt myself, but oh, so awfully changed, so vile, so full of baseness did I appear, so repulsive in every feature, even my figure was deformed. I shrank back in horror at my appearance, and prayed that the earth might open up before my feet and hide me from all eyes forevermore. Ah, never again would I call upon my love, never more desire that she should see me, better far better that she should think of me as dead and gone from her forever, better that she should have only the memory of me as I had been in earthly life, than ever know how awful was the change, how horrible a thing was my real self. Alas, alas, my despair, my anguish was extreme, and I called out wildly and struck myself and tore my hair in wild and passionate horror of myself, and then my passion exhausted me, and I sank senseless and unconscious of all once more. Again I waked, and again it was the presence of my love that awakened me. She had brought more flowers, and she murmured more soft, tender thoughts of me as she laid them on my grave. But I did not seek now to make her see me. No, I shrank back and sought to hide myself, and my heart grew hard even to her, and I said, rather let her weep for the one who has gone than know that he still lives. So I let her go. And as soon as she was gone, I called frantically to her to come back in any way, to any knowledge of my awful position, rather than leave me in that place to see her no more. She did not hear, but she felt my call, and afar off I saw her stop and half turn around as though to return. Then she passed on again and left me. Twice, 3 times, she came again, and each time when she came I felt the same shrinking from approaching her, and each time when she left I felt the same wild longing to bring her back and keep her near me. But I was called to her no more, for I knew the dead call in vain, the living hear them not, and to all the world I was dead, and only to myself and to my awful fate was I alive. Ah, now I knew death was no endless sleep, no calm oblivion. Better, far better had it been so, and in my despair I prayed that this total oblivion might be granted to me, as I prayed I knew it never could. For man is an immortal soul, and for good or evil, weal or woe, lives on eternally. His earthly form decays and turns to dust, but the spirit, which is the true man, knows no decay, no oblivion. Each day, for I felt that days were passing over me, my mind awoke more and more, and I saw clearer and clearer the events of my life pass in a long procession before me, dim at first, then by degrees growing stronger and clearer, and I bowed my head in anguish, helpless, hopeless anguish, for I felt it must be too late now to undo one single act. Chapter 3. Hope. Wanderings on the earth plane, a door to spiritual sight. I know not how long this lasted. It seemed a long, long time to me. I was sitting, wrapped still in my despair, when I heard a voice, gentle and soft, calling to me, the voice of my beloved, and I felt compelled to rise and follow that voice till it should lead me to her. And as I rose to go, the thread which had so bound me seemed to stretch and stretch, till I scarce felt its pressure, and I was drawn on and on, until at last I found myself in a room which I could dimly see, even in the darkness that always surrounded me, was familiar to my eyes. It was the home of my beloved one, and in that room I had passed, oh, how many peaceful, happy hours in that time, which seemed now separated from me by so wide and awful a gulf. She sat at a little table with a sheet of paper before her and a pencil in her hand. She kept repeating my name and saying, "Dearest of friends, if the dead ever return, come back to me, and try, if you can, make me write a few words from you, even yes or no, in answer to my questions." For the first time since I had died, I saw her with a faint smile upon her lips, and a look of hope and expectation in those dear eyes that were so heavy with weeping for me. The dear face looked so pale and sad with grief, and I felt, how I felt the sweetness of the love she had given me, and which now less than ever I dare to hope to claim. Then I saw 3 other forms beside her, but they I knew were spirits, yet how unlike myself. These spirits were bright, radiant, so that I could not bear to look at them. The sight seemed to scorch my eyes, as with a fire. One was a man, tall, calm, dignified-looking, who bent over her, to protect her, as her guardian angel might. Beside him stood 2 fair, young men, whom I knew at once to be those brothers whom she had so often spoken of to me. They had died when youth with all its pleasures was before them, and their memories were shrined in her heart, as those who were now angels. I shrank back, for I felt they saw me, and I sought to cover my disfigured face and form with the dark mantle which I wore. Then my pride awoke, and I said, "Has not she herself called me? I have come, and shall not she be the arbiter of my destiny? Is it so irrevocable that nothing I can do, no sorrow, no repentance, however deep, no deeds, however great, no work, however hard, can reverse it? Is there indeed no hope beyond the grave?" And a voice, the voice I had heard before at my own grave, answered me, "Son of grief, is there no hope on earth for those who sin? Does not even man forgive the sinner who has wronged him, if the sin be repented of and pardon sought? And shall God be less merciful, less just? Hast thou repentance even now? Search thine own heart and see whether it is for thyself or for those thou hast wronged that thou art sorry." And I knew as he spoke that I did not truly repent. I only suffered. I only loved and longed. Then again my beloved spoke and asked me if I were there and could hear her, to try and write one word through her hand, that she might know I still lived, still thought of her. My heart seemed to rise into my throat and choke me, and I drew near to try if I could move her hand, could touch it even. But the tall spirit came between us, and I was forced to draw back. Then he spoke and said, "Give your words to me, and I will cause her hand to write them down for you. I will do this for her sake, because of the love she has for you." A great wave of joy swept over me at his words, and I would have taken his hand and kissed it, but could not. My hand seemed scorched by his brightness ere I could touch him, and I bowed myself before him, for I thought he must be one of the angels. My beloved spoke once more and said, "Are you here, dearest friend?" And I answered, "Yes." And then I saw the Spirit put his hand on her, and when he did so, her hand wrote the word, "Yes." Slowly and unsteadily it moved, like a child's, learning to write. Ah, how she smiled, and again she asked me a question, and as before, her own hand traced out my answer. She asked me if there were anything she could do for me, any wish of mine that she could help me to carry out. I said, "No, not now. I would go away now and torment her no more with my presence. I would let her forget me now." My heart was so sore as I spoke, so bitter, and how sweet to me was her reply, how it touched my soul to hear her say, "Do not say that to me, for I would ever be your truest, dearest friend, as I was in the past, and since you died, my one thought has been to find you and speak with you again." And I answered, I called out to her, "It has been my only wish also." She then asked if I would come again, and I said yes, for where would I not have gone for her? What would I not have done? And then the bright spirit said she must write no more that night. He made her hand write that also, and said she should go to rest. I felt myself now drawn away once more, back to my grave and to my earthly body in that dark churchyard, but not to the same hopeless sense of misery. In spite of everything, a spark of hope had risen in my heart, and I knew I should see and speak with her again. But now I found I was not alone there. Those 2 spirits who were her brothers had followed me, and now spoke. I shall not state all they said. Suffice it to say, they pointed out to me how wide was now the gulf between their sister and myself, and asked me if I desired to shadow her all her young life with my dark presence. If I left her now, she would, in time, forget me, except as one who had been a dear friend to her. She could always think tenderly of my memory, and surely if I loved her truly, I would not wish to make all her young life lonely and desolate for my sake. I replied that I loved her, and could never bear to leave her, never bear to think of any other, loving her as I had done. Then they spoke of myself and my past, and asked if I dared to think of linking myself with her pure life, even in the misty fashion in which I still hoped to do. How could I hope that when she died I should meet her? She belonged to a bright sphere to which I could not hope for a long time to rise, and would it not be better for her, and nobler, more truly loving of me, to leave her, to forget me, and to find what happiness in life could yet be given to her, rather than seek to keep alive a love that could only bring her sorrow? I said faintly, I thought she loved me. They said, yes, she loves you as she herself has idealized your image in her mind, and she, in her innocence, has painted your picture. Do you think if she knew all your story she would love you? Would she not shrink back in horror from you? Tell the truth. Give her the choice of freedom from your presence, and you will have acted a nobler part and shown a truer love than in deceiving her and seeking to tie her to being like yourself. If you truly love her, think of her and her happiness, and what will bring it, not yourself alone. Then the hope within me died out, and I bowed my head to the dust and shame and agony, for I knew that I was vile, and in no way fit for her. And I saw as in a glass what her life might still be, freed from mine. She might know happiness yet with another more worthy than I had been, while with my love I would only drag her down into sadness with me. For the first time in my life I put the happiness of another before my own, and because I so loved her and would have had her happy, I said to them, let it be so, then. Tell her the truth, and let her say but one kind word to me in farewell, and I will go from her, and darken her life with the shadow of mine, no more. So we went back to her, and I saw her as she slept, exhausted with her sorrow for me. I pleaded that they would let me give her one kiss, the first and last that I would ever give. But they said no, that was impossible, for my touch would snap forever the thread that held her still to life. Then they awoke her, and made her write down their words, while I stood by and heard each word fall as a nail in the coffin, where they were burying my last hope forever. She, as one in a dream, rode on, till at last the whole shameful story of my life was told, and I had but to tell her myself that all was forever at an end between us, and she was free from my sinful presence and my selfish love. I said adieu to her. As drops of blood wrung from my heart were those words, and as ice they fell upon her heart and crushed it. Then I turned and left her. How, I know not, but as I went, I felt the cord that had tied me to my grave and my earthly body snap, and I was free to wander where I would, alone in my desolation. And then, ah me, while I write the words, the tears of thankfulness are in my eyes again, and I almost break down in trying to write them. Then she, whom we had deemed so weak and gentle that we had but to decide for her, she called me back with all the force of a love none dare oppose, called me back to her. She said she could never give me up so long as I had love for her. Let your past be what it might. Let you be sunk now even to the lowest depths of hell itself. I will still love you, still seek to follow you, and claim my right, the right of my love, to help and comfort and cherish you, till God in his mercy shall have pardoned your past, and you shall be raised up again. And then it was that I broke down and wept as only a strong, proud man can weep, whose heart has been wrung and bruised and hardened, and then touched by the soft, tender touch of the loving hand, till the tears must come to his relief. I went back to my love and knelt down beside her, and though they would not let me touch her, that calm, beautiful spirit who was her guardian whispered to her that her prayer was answered, and that she should indeed lead me back to the light. And so I left my darling, and as I passed away I saw a white angel's form hover over her to give her strength and comfort, who was herself my angel of light. I left her thus with those spirits, and went forth to wander till her voice should call me to her side again. After the short, troubled sleep into which those bright spirits had put her, my darling awoke the next day, and went to visit a kind, good man whom she had discovered in her efforts to find some way back by which she might reach me even beyond the grave. If it might be that what she had been told about those people who were called spiritualists was really true, she hoped through her aid to speak again with me. and prompted by those who were watching over her, she had searched out this man who was known as a healing medium, and by him she had been told that if she herself tried, she could write a message from the so-called dead. This I did not learn till later. At the time, I only felt myself summoned by the voice of her whose power was over me so great, and in obedience to it, I found myself standing in what I could dimly distinguish to be a small room. I say dimly, because all was still dark to me, save only where the light around my darling shone as a star and showed faintly what was near. It was to this good man of whom I speak that she had gone, and it was her voice speaking to him that had drawn me. She was telling him what had passed the night before, and how much she loved me, and how she would gladly give all her life if by doing so she could comfort and help me. And that man spoke such kind words to her from my heart. I thanked and still thank him for them. He gave me so much hope. He pointed out to my dear love that the ties of the earth body are broken at its death, and I was free to love her, and she was free to return that love, that she herself, better than any other, could in truth help to raise me, for her love would give me comfort and hope as nothing else would do, and would cheer my path of repentant effort. And she had now the best of rights to give it. My love for her had been so pure and true a passion, while hers for me was stronger than death itself, since it had overcome the barrier of death. He was so kind, this man. He helped me to speak with her, and to explain many things as I could not have done the night before, when my heart was so sore, full of pride. He helped me to tell what of excuse there had been for me in the past, though I owned that nothing can truly excuse our sins. He let me tell her that in spite of all the wrong of my past, she had been to me as one sacred, loved with a love I had given to none but herself. He soothed and strengthened her with a kindness for which I blessed him even more than for his help to myself, and when she left him at last, I, too, went with her to her home, the light of hope in both our hearts. And when we got there, I found that a fresh barrier was raised up by those two spirit brothers and others to whom she was dear. An invisible wall surrounded her, through which I could not pass. And though I might follow her about, I could not get very near. Then I said to myself that I would go back to the kind man and see if he would help me. My wish seemed to carry me back, for I soon found myself there again. He was at once conscious of my presence, and strange as it may seem, I found that he could understand much, although not all, that I said to him. He gathered the sense of what I wanted to say, and told me many things that I shall not set down here, since they concerned only myself. He assured me that if I were only patient, all would be well in time, and though the relations might build their spiritual wall around my love, her will would at all times draw me through it to her, and nothing could shut out her love from me. No walls could keep that back. If I would seek now to learn the things of the Spirit and work to advance myself, the gulf between us would disappear. Comforted, I left him and wandered away again, I knew not where. I was now beginning to be dimly conscious that there were other beings like myself flitting about near me in the darkness, though I could scarce see them. I was so lost and lonely that I thought of going back to my grave again, as it was the spot most familiar to me, and my thought seemed to take me back, for soon I was there once more. The flowers that my love had brought me were faded now. She had not been there for 2 days. Since speaking to me, she seemed to forget the body that was laid away in the earth, and this to me was well, and I would have had it so. It was well for her to forget the dead body and think only of the living spirit. Even these withered flowers spoke of her love, and I tried to pick one up, a white rose, to carry away with me. I found I could not lift it. I could not move it in the least. My hand passed through it as though it was but the reflection of a rose. I moved round to where there was a white marble cross at the head of the grave, and I saw there the names of my beloved one's 2 brothers. Then I knew what she had done in her love for me. She had laid my body to rest beside those she had loved best of all. My heart was so touched that again I wept, and my tears fell like dew upon my heart and melted away its bitterness. I was so lonely that at last I rose and wandered away amongst other dark wandering shapes, few of whom even turned to look at me. Perhaps like myself they scarcely saw. Presently, however, 3 dark forms, which seemed like 2 women and a man, passed near me, and then turned and followed. The man touched my arm and said, "Where are you bound for? Surely you are newly come over to this side, or you would not hurry on so. None hurry here, because we all know we have eternity to wander in." He laughed, a laugh so cold and harsh in tone, it made me shudder. One of the women took my arm on one side, and one on the other, saying, "Come away with us, and we will show you how you may enjoy life even though you are dead. If we have not got bodies to enjoy ourselves through, we will borrow them from some mortals for a little. Come with us, and we will show you that all pleasure is not ended yet." In my loneliness, I was glad to have some being to speak to, that although they were all 3 most repulsive looking, the women to mind even more so than the man, I felt inclined to let them lead me away and see what would happen, and I had even turned to accompany them, when afar off in the dim distance, like a picture traced in the light on a black sky, I saw the spirit form of my pure sweet love. Her eyes were closed as I had seen her in my first vision, but as before her hands were stretched out to me, and her voice fell like a voice from heaven on my ears, saying, "Oh, take care, go not with them, they are not good, and their road leads only to destruction." Then the vision was gone, and as one waking from a dream, I shook those 3 persons from me and hurried away again in the darkness. How long and how far I wandered, I know not. I kept hurrying on to get away from the memories that haunted me, and I seemed to have all space to wander in. At last I sat down on the ground to rest, for there seemed to be ground solid enough to rest upon, and while I sat there, I saw glimmering through the darkness a light. As it drew near, I saw a great haze of light radiating from a room which I could see, but it was so bright it hurt my eyes to look upon it, as would looking at the noonday sun on earth have done. I could not bear it, and would have turned away, when a voice said, "Stay, weary wanderer. Here are only kind hearts and helping hands for you, and if you would see your love, come in, for she is here, and you may speak with her." Then I felt a hand, for I could see no one, draw my mantle over my head to shut out the brightness of the light, and then lead me into the room and seat me in a large chair. I was so weary and so glad to rest, and in this room there was such peace. It seemed to me that I had found my way to heaven. After a little I looked up and saw 2 gentle, kindly women who were like angels to my eyes, and I said to myself, "I have come near to heaven, surely." Again I looked, and by this time my eyes seemed strengthened, for beyond those 2 fair good women, and at first I could scarce believe it, so great was my joy, I saw my beloved herself smiling sadly but tenderly at where I sat. She smiled, but I knew she did not really see me. One of the ladies did, though, and she was describing me to my darling in a low, quiet voice. My darling seemed so pleased, for it confirmed to her what the man had told her. She had been telling these ladies what a remarkable experience she had had, and how it seemed to her like a strange dream. I could have cried out to her then that I was truly there, that I still lived, still loved her, and was trusting in her love for me, but I could not move. Some spell was over me, some power I could dimly feel was holding me back. And then those 2 kind ladies spoke, and I knew they were not angels yet, for they were still in their earthly bodies, and she could see and speak to them. They said much of what the kind good man had done, as to the hope there was for sinners like me. The same voice which had bidden me to enter now asked, would I like one of the ladies to write a message for me? I said yes, 1,000 times yes. Then I spoke my words, and the Spirit caused the lady to write them down. I said to my beloved that I still lived, still loved her, and bid her never to forget me, never to cease think of me, for I required all her love and help to sustain me. I was ever the same to her, though now I was weak and helpless and could not make her see me. And she gave me such sweet words in return. I cannot write them down. They are too sacred to me, and still rest in my heart forevermore. The period that followed this interview was one of deep sleep for me. I was so exhausted that when I left that room I wandered on a little way and then sank down upon the ground in deep, dreamless unconsciousness. What did it matter where I rested when all was night around me? How long my sleep lasted, I know not. At that period I had no means of counting time save by the amount of suffering and misery through which I passed. From my slumbers I awoke refreshed in a measure, and with all my senses stronger in me than before. I could move more rapidly, my limbs felt stronger and freer, and I was now conscious of a desire to eat I had not felt before. My longing grew so great that I went in search of food, and for a long time could find none anywhere. At last I found what looked like hard, dry bread, a few crusts only, but I was glad to eat them, whereupon I felt more satisfied. Here I may say that spirits do eat the spiritual counterpart of your food, do feel both hunger and thirst, as keen to them as your appetites are to you on earth, although neither our food nor our drink would be any more visible to your material sight than our spiritual bodies are, and yet for us they possess objective reality. Had I been a drunkard or a lover of pleasures of the table in my earthly body, I should much sooner have felt the cravings of appetite. As it was, nature with me had ever been easily satisfied, and though at first I turned from those dry crusts in disgust, a little reflection told me that I had now no way of procuring anything. I was like a beggar, and had better content myself with a beggar's fare. My thoughts had now turned to my beloved again, and the thoughts carried my spirit with them, so that I found myself entering once more the room where I had last seen her and the two ladies. This time I seemed to pass in at once, and was received by two spirit men whom I could but very faintly see. A veil seemed to hang between us, through which I saw those two spirit men, the ladies and my beloved. I was told that I might again give a message to her through the lady who had written my words before. I was so anxious to try if I could not make my darling write down words herself as I had seen her guardian spirit do, that I was allowed to try. To my disappointment, I found I could not do it. She was deaf to all I said, and I had to give up that idea and let the lady write for me as before. After I had given my message, I rested for a short time and watched my beloved one's sweet face, as I had been wont to do in other happier days. My musings were interrupted by one of those spirit men, a grave, handsome young man he seemed to be so far as I could see him. He spoke to me in a quiet, kindly voice, and said that if I truly desired to write my own words through my darling herself, it would be well for me to join a brotherhood of penitents, who like myself desired to follow out the better way, and with them I should learn many things of which I was yet ignorant, and which would help me to fit myself to control her mind as well as give me the privilege I sought of being with her at times while she dwelt on earth. This way of repentance was hard, he said, very hard, the steps many, the toil and suffering great, but it led to a fair and happy land at last, where I should rest in happiness such as I could not dream of now. He assured me, even as the kind earthly man had done, that my deformed body, which I was still so anxious to hide from my beloved one's eyes, would change as my spirit changed, till I should be once more fair to look upon, such as she would no longer grieve to see. Were I to remain upon the earth plane as I now was, I should most likely be drawn back into my former haunts of so-called pleasure, and in that atmosphere of spiritual degradation I should soon lose the power to be near my darling at all. For her own sake, those who guarded her would be obliged to exclude me. On the other hand, were I to join this brotherhood, which was one of hope and endeavor, I should be so helped, so strengthened, and so taught, that when in due course my time came to return to the earth plane, I should have acquired the strength and an armor that could resist its temptations. I listened to the words of this grave, courteous spirit with wonder and a growing desire to know more of this brotherhood of whom he spoke, and begged he would take me to them. This he assured me he would do, and he also explained that I should be there of my own free will and choice only. Did I desire at any time to leave, I could do so at once. All are free in the spirit world, he said, all must follow only where their own wishes and desires lead them. If you study to cultivate the higher desires, means you will be given to attain them, and you will be strengthened with such help and strength as you may need. You are one who has never learned the power of prayer. You will learn it now, for all things come by earnest prayer, whether you are conscious that you pray or not. For good or for evil, your desires are as prayers, and call around you good or evil powers to answer them for you. As I was again growing weary and exhausted, he suggested that I should bid adieu to my darling for a time. He explained that I should gain more strength, as well as permit her to do so if I left her for the time I was to remain in this place of which he spoke. It would also be well that she should try not to write for 3 months, as her mediumistic powers had been greatly tried, and if she did not rest them, she would be much impaired, while I would require all that time to learn even simple lessons needful before I could control her. Ah me, how hard it seemed to us both to make this promise, but she set me the example, and I could but follow it. If she would try to be strong and patient, so should I, and I registered a vow that if the God I had so long forgotten would remember and pardon me now, I would give all my life and all my powers to undo the wrongs that I had done. And so it was that I left for a time the troubled earth plane of the spirit world of which I had yet seen so little, but in which I was yet to see and suffer so much. As I left the room to go with my new guide, I turned to my love and waved my hand in farewell, and asked that the good angels and the God I dare not pray to for myself might bless her and keep her safe forevermore. And the last thing I saw was her tender eyes following me with that look of love and hope, which was to sustain me through many a weary, painful hour. Chapter 4. The Brotherhood of Hope. In the spirit world, there are many strange places, many wondrous sights, and many organizations for helping repentant souls, but I have never seen anything more strange in its way than this home of help, conducted by the Brotherhood of Hope, to which I was now conducted. In the feeble condition of all my spiritual faculties, I was not able to see what the place was like. I was almost like one who is deaf, dumb, and blind. When I was with others, I could scarcely hear them or make them hear me, and although I could see a little, it was more as though I was in a perfectly dark room, with only one small feeble glimmer of light to show me where I went. On the earth plane, I had not felt this so much, for though all was darkness, I could both see and hear enough to be conscious of those near me. It was in ascending even to the little distance at which this place was above the earth that I felt the absence of all but the most material developments of my spirit. That time of darkness was so awful to me that even now I scarce like to recall it. I had so loved the sunshine and light. I came from a land where all is sunshine and brightness, where the colors are so rich, the sky so clear, the flowers and the scenery so beautiful, and I so loved light and warmth and melody. And here, as elsewhere since my death, I had found only darkness and coldness and gloom, an appalling and enshrouding gloom that wrapped round me like a mantle of night, from which I could in no way free myself, and this awful gloom crushed my spirit, as nothing else could have done. I had been proud and haughty on earth. I came of a race that knew not what it was to bow before anyone. In my veins ran the blood of its haughty nobles. Through my mother, I was allied to the great ones of earth, whose ambitions had moved kingdoms to their will. And now the lowest, humblest, poorest beggar of my native streets was greater, happier than I, for he at least had the sunshine and the free air, and I was the lowest, most degraded prisoner in the dungeon cell. Had it not been for one of my star Hope, my angel of light, and the hopes she had given me through her love, I must have sunk into apathy of despair. But when I thought of her waiting, as she vowed she would do all her life for me, when I recalled her sweet and tender smile and the loving words she had spoken to me, my heart and my courage revived again, and I strove to endure, to be patient, to be strong. I had need of all to help me, For from now began a period of suffering and conflict I shall in vain seek to make anyone fully realize. This place where I was now I could barely see in all its details. It was like a huge prison, dim and misty in its outlines. Later on, I saw it was a great building of dark gray stone, as solid to my eyes as earthly stone, with many long passages, some long, large halls or rooms, but mostly composed of innumerable little cells with scarcely any light and only the barest of furniture. Each spirit had only what he'd earned by his earthly life, and some had nothing but the little couch whereon they lay and suffered. For all suffered there. It was the house of sorrow, yet it was also a house of hope, for all there were striving upwards to the light, and for each had begun the time of hope. Each had his foot planted upon the lowest rung of the ladder of hope, by which he should in time mount even to heaven itself. In my own little cell there was but my bed, a table, and a chair, nothing more. I spent my time in resting or meditating in my cell, and going with those who, like myself, soon grew strong enough to hear the lectures which were delivered to us in the great hall. Very impressive those lectures were, told in the form of a story, but always so as to bring home to the mind of each of us those things wherein we had done wrong. Great pains were taken to make us understand, from the point of view of an impartial spectator, the full consequences to ourselves and others of each of our actions, and where we had for our own selfish gratifications wronged or dragged down another soul. So many things which we had done because all men did them, or because we thought that we as men had the right to do them, were now shown to us from the other side of the picture, from those who had in measure been our victims, or where we personally were not directly responsible for their fall, the victims of a social system invented and upheld to gratify us and our selfish passions. I cannot more fully describe these lectures, but those amongst you who know what are the corruptions of the great cities of the earth will easily supply for yourselves the subjects. From such lectures, such pictures of ourselves as we were, stripped of all the social disguises of earth life, we could but return in shame and sorrow of heart to ourselves, to reflect over our past and to strive to atone for it in our future. And in this there was great help given to us, for with the error and its consequences we were always shown the way to correct and overcome the evil desire in ourselves, and how we might atone for our own sins by timely efforts to save another from evil into which we had fallen, all these lessons being intended to fit us for the next stage of our progression, in which we would be sent back to earth to help unseen and unknown mortals who were struggling with earth's temptations. When we were not attending the lectures, we were free to go where we might wish, that is, such of us as were strong enough to move about freely. Some who had left dear friends on earth would go visit them, that unseen themselves they might yet see those they loved. We were always warned, however, not to linger in the temptations of the earth plane, since many of us would find it difficult to resist them. Those who were strongest among us and who possessed the needful qualities and desire to use them were employed in magnetizing those who were weakest, and who, by reason of the excessive dissipations of their earthly lives, were in such terrible condition of exhaustion and suffering that the only thing which could be done with them was to allow them to lie helpless in their cells, while others gave them a little relief by magnetizing them. And here I must describe to you a very wonderful system of healing those poor spirits, which was practiced in this house of hope. Some advanced spirits, whose natural desire and tastes made them doctors and healers, with the help of other spirits of different degrees of advancement under them, would attend upon these poorest and most suffering ones, where indeed were all sufferers, and by means of magnetism and use of others' powers which they could control, they would put these poor spirits into temporary forgetfulness of their pain. And though they awoke again to a renewal of their sufferings, yet in these intervals their spirits gained strength, and insensibly grew more able to endure, till at last their sufferings were mitigated with time and the growing development of the spirit body, and they in turn would, when fit to do so, be employed to magnetize others who were still suffering. It is impossible for me to give you a very clear picture of this place and those in it, for although the resemblance to an earthly hospital was very great, there were many little points in which it resembled nothing which you have yet on earth, though as knowledge on earth advances, the resemblance will become closer. All was so dark in this place, because the unfortunate spirits who dwelt there had none of the brightness of happy spirits to give into the atmosphere, and it is the state of the spirit itself in the spiritual world that makes the lightness or darkness of its surroundings. The sense of darkness was also due to the almost total blindness of these poor spirits, whose spiritual senses, never having been developed on earth, made them alike insensible to all around them, just as those born on earth in a state of blindness, deafness, and dumbness would be unconscious of the things which were apparent to those fully endowed with senses. In visiting the atmosphere of the earthly plane, which was a degree more suited to their state of development, these poor spirits would still be in darkness, though it would not be so complete, and they would possess the power of seeing those beings like themselves with whom they could come into direct contact, and also such mortals as were in a sufficiently low spiritual degree of development. The higher and more spiritualized mortals, and still the more disembodied spirits in advance of them, would be only very dimly discernible, or even totally invisible. The working brothers of hope, as they were called, were each provided with a tiny little light like a star, whose rays illuminated the darkness of the cells they visited, and carried the light of hope wherever the brothers went. I myself at first was so great a sufferer that I used simply to lie in my cell in a state of almost apathetic misery, watching for this spark to come glimmering down the long corridor to my door, and wondering how long it would be in earth time ere it would come again. But it was not long that I lay thus utterly prostrate. Unlike many of the poor spirits who had added a love of drink to their other vices, my mind was too clear and my desire to improve too strong to leave me long inactive, and as soon as I found myself able to move again, I petitioned to be allowed to do something, however humble, which might be of use. I was therefore, as being myself possessed of strong magnetic powers, set to help an unfortunate young man who was utterly unable to move, and who used to lie moaning and sighing all the time. Poor fellow, he was only 30 years old when he left the earthly body, but in his short life he had contrived to plunge into such dissipations that he had prematurely killed himself, and was now suffering such agonies from the reaction upon the spirit of those powers he had abused, that it was often more than I could bear to witness them. My task was to make soothing passes over him, by which means he would obtain a little relief, till at stated times a more advanced spirit than myself would come and put him into a state of unconsciousness. And all this time I was myself suffering keenly, both in mind and in my spirit body, for in the lower spheres the spirit is conscious of bodily sufferings. As it grows more advanced, the suffering becomes more purely mental, the less material envelope of the higher spirits making them at last insensible to anything like material pain. As my strength grew, so did my desires revive and cause me so much torment that I was often tempted to do what many poor spirits did, go back to earth in search of the means to satisfy them through the material bodies of those yet on earth. My bodily sufferings grew very great, for the strength I had been so proud of and had used so bad a purpose made me suffer more than one who had been weak. As the muscles of an athlete who has used them to excess begin after time to contract and cause him excruciating pain, so those powers and that strength which I had abused in my earthly life now began, through its inevitable reaction on my spirit body, to cause the most intense suffering. And then as I grew stronger and stronger and able to enjoy what had seemed enjoyment in my earth life, the desire for those pleasures grew and grew till I could scarce refrain from returning to the earth plane there to enjoy, through the organism of those yet in the flesh, whose sordid lives and low desires placed them on a level with the spirits of the earth plane, those pleasures of the senses which had still so great a temptation for us. Many of those who were in the house of hope with me would yield to the temptation and go back for a time to haunt the earth, whence they would return after a longer or shorter period, exhausted and degraded even below their former state. All were free to go or stay as they desired. All could return when they wished, for the doors of Hope's castle were never shut upon anyone, however unthankful or unworthy they might be, and I have often wondered at the infinite patience and tenderness which were ever shown for our weaknesses and our sins. It was indeed only possible to pity these unfortunates who had made such utter slaves of themselves to their base desires that they could not resist them, and were drawn back time after time, till at last, satiated and exhausted, they could move no more, and were like the unfortunate young man whom I tended. For myself, I might have also yielded to the temptation had it not been for the thoughts of my pure love, and the hope she had given me, the purer desires she had inspired, and I, at least, could not condemn these poor erring souls who had no such blessings granted them. I went to earth very often, but it was to where my beloved one dwelt, and her love drew me ever to her side, away from all temptations, into the pure atmosphere of her home, and I thought I could never approach near enough to touch her, by reason of this icy invisible wall which I have described. I used to stand out of it, looking at her as she sat and worked, read, or slept. When I was there, she would always be in a dim way conscious of my presence, and would whisper my name or turn to where I was with one of her sad, sweet smiles that I would carry the recollection of and comfort myself with in my lonely hours. She looked so sad, so very sad, my poor love, and so pale and delicate, it made my heart ache even while it comforted me to see her. I could tell that in spite of all her efforts to be brave and patient and to hope, the strain was almost too great for her, and each day she grew more delicate looking. She had many other things to try her at this time. There were family troubles and the doubts and fears suggested by the strangeness of her intercourse with the world of spirits. At times, she would wonder if it were not all wild delusion, a dream from which she would wake to find there was, after all, no communication between the dead and living, no means by which she could reach me again. And then a dull despair would seize upon her and upon me also, as I stood beside her and read her feeling, helpless and powerless to make her realize my actual presence beside her, and I would pray to be allowed in some way to make her know that I was there. One night, I had watched her sink into a sleep after a weary time of weeping. I, who could have wept too in my grief for us both, was suddenly touched upon the shoulder, and looking up, beheld her guardian spirit, who had first helped me speak with her. He asked me if I would be very quiet and self-restrained if he allowed me to kiss her as she slept, and I, wild with this new joy, most eagerly promised. Taking my hand in his, we passed together through the transparent, icy wall that was to me so impervious. Bending over her, the guide made some strange motions with his hand, and then, taking one of my hands in his for a few moments, he bade me touch her very gently. She was lying quietly asleep, with the tears still on her eyelashes and her sweet lips slightly parted as though she was speaking in her dreams. One hand rested against her cheek, and I took it in mine, so gently, so tenderly, not to awaken her. Her hand closed half-consciously upon mine, and a look of such joy came into her face that I feared she would awake. But no, the bright spirit smiled at us both and said, "Kiss her now." And I stooped over her and touched her at last, and gave her the first kiss I had ever given. I kissed her not once, but 6 times, so passionately that she awoke, and the bright spirit drew me away in haste. She looked round and asked softly, "Do I dream, or was that indeed my beloved one?" I answered, "Yes," and she seemed to hear, for she smiled so sweet a smile, so sweet, and again she repeated my name softly to herself. Not for long after that would they allow me to touch her again, but I was often near, and the joy of that one meeting dwelt in our hearts for many an hour. I could see how real had been my kiss to her, and for me it was an anchor of hope encouraging me to believe that in time I should indeed be able to make her feel my touch and hold communication with her. Chapter 5. Spirits of the Earth Plane. The time came at last for me to leave the House of Hope and go forth, strong in the lessons I had learned there, to work out my atonement on the earth plane and in those lower spheres to which my earthly life had sunk me. 8 or 9 months had elapsed since I had died, and I had grown strong and vigorous once more. I could move freely over the great sphere of the earth plane. My sight and my other senses were so far developed that I could see and hear and speak clearly. The light around me now was that of a faint twilight, or when the night first begins to dawn into the day. To my eyes, so long accustomed to the darkness, this dull light was very welcome, though after time I grew so to long for the true day to dawn that this dull twilight was most monotonous and depressive. Those countries which are situated in this, the third circle of the earth plane, or first sphere, are called the Twilight Lands, and it is thither that those spirits pass whose lives have been too selfish and material to allow their souls to reach any higher state of development. Even these Twilight Lands, however, are a degree above those haunting spirits of the earth plane, who are literally earth-bound to their former habitations. My work was begun upon the earth itself, and in those haunts which men of the world call haunts of pleasure, though no pleasure is so fleeting, no degradation so sure as that which they can produce even during the earthly life. And now I found the value of the teachings and the experience I had gained during my stay in the House of Hope. Temptations that might once have seemed such to me were such no longer. I knew the satisfaction such pleasures give, and the cost at which alone they can be bought, and thus in controlling a mortal, as I often had to do, I was proof against the temptation such control offered, using his body for my own gratification. Few people yet in their earthly envelopes understand that spirits can, and very often do, take such complete possession of the bodies of mortal men and women that, for the time, it is as though that earthly body belonged to the disembodied and not the embodied spirit. Many cases of so-called temporary madness are due to the controlling power of very low spirits of evil desires or frivolous minds, who are, through the weakness of will or other causes, put into complete rapport with the embodied spirit, whose body they seek to use. Amongst many ancient races, this fact was acknowledged and studied, as well as many branches of the occult sciences which we of the 19th century have grown too wise, forsooth, to look into, even to discover, if we can, those germs of truth with which all ages have been blessed, and which are worth disinterring from the mass of rubbish in which succeeding generations of men have buried them. The work upon which I was now engaged will seem no less strange to you than it did at first to me. The Great Brotherhood of Hope was only one of a countless variety of societies in which exists the spirit world for the purpose of giving help to all who are in need. Their operations are carried on everywhere and in all spheres, and their members are to be found from the very lowest and darkest spheres to the very highest which surround the earth, and even extend into the spheres of the solar systems. They are like immense chains of spirits, the lowest and humblest beings always helped and protected by those above. A message would be sent to the Brotherhood that help was required to assist some struggling mortal or unhappy spirit, and such one of the brothers was thought to be most fit would be sent to help. Such a one of us would be sent as had his own earth life yielded to a similar temptation and had suffered all the bitter consequences and remorse for his sin. Often the man or woman to be helped had unconsciously sent out an aspiration for help and strength to resist temptation, and that of itself was a prayer, which would be heard in the spirit world as a cry from earth's children that appealed to all in the spirit world who had been themselves earth's sons and daughters. Or it might be that some spirit to whom the struggling one was very dear would seek help on their behalf and would thus appeal us to come to their aid. Our task would be to follow and control the one we desired, to help till the temptation had been overcome, we would identify ourselves so closely with the mortal that for a time we actually shared his life, his thoughts, everything. And during this dual state of existence, we ourselves often suffered most keenly both from our anxiety for the man whose thoughts became almost as our own, and from the fact that his anxieties were as ours, while in thus going over again a chapter in our past lives, we endured all the sorrow, remorse, and bitterness of the past time. He, on his side, felt, though not so in keen a degree, the sorrowful state of our mind, and where the control was very complete and the mortal highly sensitive, he would often fancy that things which we had done must have been done by himself, either in some former forgotten stage of existence, or else seen in some vivid dream they could scarcely recall. This controlling or overshadowing of a mortal by an immortal is used in many ways, and those who foolishly make themselves liable to it, either by a careless, evil life, or by seeking in a frivolous spirit of mere curiosity to search out mysteries too deep for their shallow minds to fathom, often find to their cost that the low spirits who haunt the earth plane, and even those from much lower spheres, can often obtain so great a hold over a mortal that at last he becomes a mere puppet in their hands, whose body they can use at will. Many a weak-willed man and woman who in pure surroundings would lead only good and pure lives are drawn by evil surroundings into sins for which they are but partly responsible, sins for which indeed those controlling spirits who have thus made use of these weak mortals will be held responsible, as well as the mortal sinner himself. For thus tempting and using another's organism, those evil spirits will have to render a terrible account, since they have been doubly guilty. In sinning themselves and in dragging down another's soul with them, they sink themselves to a depth from which many years, and in some instances many centuries of suffering, cannot free them. In my work, I have had to act the part of controlling spirit many times, but I was sent to do so only in order that I might impress the mortal with a sense of the terrible consequences of yielding to sin, and also that I might, when not actually controlling the mortal myself, act as a guard and watchman to protect him from the control of the wandering, tempting spirits of the earth plane. My work was to raise the barrier of my strong will force against theirs, and keep them back so that they could not come sufficiently en rapport with my charge to control him. If, however, he had allowed himself to be already controlled by these lower spirits, they would still be able to project their thoughts and suggestions to him, though they did so with difficulty. Although I did not know it at the time, and believed that upon myself would rest the responsibility of keeping safe those I was sent to guard, I was only the last link in a long chain of spirits who were all helping at the same time. Each spirit was a step in advance of the one below him, and each had to strengthen and help the one below him should he faint or fail in his task. My part was also intended to be a lesson to myself, in self-denial and the sacrifice of my own comfort that I might help another. My condition as a spirit on the earth plane made me of use, seeing that I could oppose a material force of will against those tempting spirits in atmosphere where a more refined spirit would have been unable to penetrate, and I, as one of the earthbound myself, could come in rapport with the mortal more closely than a more advanced spirit would have been able to do. I had, by means of dreams, when he slept, and constant haunting thoughts while he waked, to impress upon the mind of the man I controlled what my experience had been, to make him feel all the terrible sufferings of remorse and fear, all the loathing of himself through which I had passed, and through which I passed again in bitter agony of soul while thus recalling them. All my feelings were transferred to his mind till he might truly have said he was haunted by all the terrible possibilities of his meditated sins. Over this particular phase of my experiences I shall not dwell longer now, since it is one familiar to many on this side of life. I will but say that I returned from my mission with a consciousness that I had saved many others from the pitfalls into which I had fallen, and thereby had atoned in part for my own sins. Several times I was sent upon such missions, and each time returned successful, And here I must pause to say that if my progress in spirit world has been so rapid as to surprise most who knew of my first condition on entering it, and if I again and again resisted all the temptations that befell me, the credit is not so much due to myself as to the wonderful help and comfort that was given to me by the constant and unvarying love of her who was indeed my good angel, and whose image ever came between me and all harm. When all others might have pleaded to me in vain, I ever hearkened to her voice and turned aside. When I was not helping someone yet in the earth body, I was sent to work amongst the unhappy spirits of the earth plane, who were still wandering in its darkness, even as I had first done. And to them I was one of the great brotherhood of hope, bearing in my hand the tiny star-like light that is the symbol of the order. Its rays would dispel the darkness around me, and I would see poor, unhappy spirits crouching on the ground, 2 or 3 together, or sunk in helpless misery in some corner by themselves, too hopeless, too unhappy to heed anything. To them it was my work to point out how they could either be taken to such a house of hope as the one in which I had been, or in other cases, how they might be trying to help others around them, help themselves, and earn the gratitude of those who were even more hopeless than themselves. To each poor, suffering soul, a different balm of healing would be given, for each had known a different experience, and each had a different cause for his sins. Chapter 6. Twilight Lands, Love's Gifts, the Valley of Selfishness, the Country of Unrest, the Miser's Land, the Gambler's Land. When my period of work in any place was finished, I used to return to the Twilight Land to rest in another large building which belonged to our brotherhood. It was somewhat like the other place in appearance, only not quite so dark, nor so dismal, nor so bare, and in the little room which belonged to each there were such things as we had earned as the rewards of our labors. For instance, in my room, which was still somewhat bare-looking, I had one great treasure. This was a picture of my love. It seemed more like a reflection of her in a mirror than a mere painted image, for when I looked intently at her, she would smile back at me and answer, as though her spirit was conscious of my gaze, and when I wished very much to know what she was doing, my picture would change and show me. This was regarded by all of my companions as a great and wonderful privilege, and I was told it was as much the result of her love and constant thought for me as of my own efforts to improve. Since then, I have been shown how this living image was thrown upon the light of the astral plane and then projected into its frame in my room, but I cannot explain it more fully in this book. Another gift from my darling was a white rosebud, which I had in a small vase, and which never seemed to fade or wither, but remained fresh and fragrant, and ever an emblem of her love, so that I called her my white rose. I had so longed for a flower, I had so loved flowers on earth, and I had seen none since I saw those my darling put upon my grave. In this land there were no flowers, not even a leaf or a blade of grass, not a tree or a shrub, however stunted, for the dry, arid soil of our selfishness had no blossom or green thing to give any one of us. And it was when I told her this during one of the brief visits I used to pay her, and when through her own hand I was able to write short messages, it was, I say, when I told her that there was not one fair thing for me to look upon, save only the picture of herself, that she asked that I might be given a flower from her. And this white rosebud was brought to my room by a spirit friend, and left for me to find when I returned from earth and her. Ah, you who have so many flowers that you do not value them enough and leave them to wither unseen. You can scarce realize what joy this blossom brought me to, nor how I have so treasured it and her picture and some loving words she once wrote to me, that I have carried them with me from sphere to sphere as I have risen, and shall, I hope, treasure them evermore. From this twilight land I took many journeys and saw many strange and different countries, but all bore the same stamp of coldness and desolation. One place was a great valley of gray stones, with dim, cold gray hills, shutting it on every side, and this twilight sky overhead. Here again, not a blade of grass, not one poor stunted shrub was to be seen, not one touch of color or brightness anywhere, only this dull desolation of gray stones. Those who dwelt in this valley had centered their lives and their affections in themselves, and had shut up their hearts against all the warmth and beauty of unselfish love. They had lived only for themselves, their own gratification, their own ambitions, and now they saw nothing but themselves and the gray desolation of their hard, selfish lives around them. There were a great many beings flitting uneasily about in this valley, but strange to say, they had been so centered in themselves that they had lost the power to see anyone else. These unhappy beings were invisible to each other until such time as the thought of another and the desire to do something for someone besides themselves should awaken, and when they would become conscious of those near them, and through their efforts to lighten another's lot, they would improve their own, till at last their stunted affections would expand, and the hazy valley of selfishness would hold them in its chains no more. Beyond this valley, I came upon a great, dry, sandy-looking tract of country, where there was a scanty, straggling vegetation, and where the inhabitants had begun in some places to make small attempts at gardens near their habitations. In some places, these habitations were clustered so thickly together that they formed small towns and cities, but all bore that desolate, ugly look which came from the spiritual poverty of the inhabitants. This also was a land of selfishness and greed, although not of such complete indifference to others' feelings as in the Gray Valley, and therefore they sought for a certain amount of companionship even with those around them. Many had come from the Gray Valley, but most were direct from the earth life, and were now poor souls struggling to rise a little higher, and wherever this was the case and an effort was made to overcome their own selfishness, then the dry soil around their homes would begin to put forth tiny blades of grass and little stunted shoots of shrubs. Such miserable hovels as were in this land, such ragged, repulsive, wretched-looking people, like tramps or beggars, yet many had been amongst earth's wealthiest and most eminent in fashionable life, and had enjoyed all that luxury could give. But because they had used their wealth only for themselves and their own enjoyments, giving to others but the paltry crumbs that they could spare from their own wealth, and hardly noticed that they had given them, because of this, I say, they were now here in this twilight land, poor as beggars in the true spiritual wealth of the soul, which may be earned in the earthly life alike by the richest king or the poorest beggar, and without which those who come over to the spirit land, be they of earth's greatest or humblest, must come here to dwell, where all are alike poor in spiritual things. Here some of the people would wrangle and quarrel and complain that they had not been fairly treated in being in such a place, seeing what had been their positions in earth life. They would blame others as being more culpable than themselves in the matter, and wake 1,000 excuses, 1,000 pretenses to anyone who would listen to them and the story of what they would call their wrongs. Others would still be trying to follow out the schemes of their earthly lives, and would try to make their hearers believe that they had found means, at the expense of someone else, of ending all this weary life of discomfort, and would plot and plan and try to carry out their own schemes and spoil those of others as being likely to interfere with theirs, and so would go the weary round of life in this land of unrest. To all whom I found willing to listen to me, I gave some word of hope, some thought of encouragement or help, to find the true way out of this country, and so passed on through it and journeyed into the land of misers, a land given over to them alone, for few have sympathy with true misers save those who also share their all-absorbing desire to hoard simply for the pleasure of hoarding. In this country were dark, crooked-looking beings with long, claw-like fingers who were scratching in the black soil like birds of prey in search of stray grains of gold that here and there rewarded their toil. And when they had found any, they would wrap them up in little wallets they carried and thrust them into their bosoms, that they might lie next to their hearts as the thing of all things most dear to them. As a rule, they were lonely, solitary beings who avoided each other by instinct, lest they should be robbed of their cherished treasure. Here I found nothing that I could do. Only one solitary man listened for a brief moment to what I had to say, ere he returned to his hunt in the earth for treasure, furtively watching me till I was gone, lest I should learn what he had already got. The others were all so absorbed in their search for treasure, they could not even be made conscious of my presence, and soon I passed on from that bleak land. From the miser's country, I passed downwards into a dark sphere, which was really below the earth in the sense of being even lower in its spiritual inhabitants than parts of the earth plane. Here it was very much like the land of unrest, only that the spirits who dwelt here were worse and more degraded looking. There was no attempt made at cultivation, and the sky overhead was almost dark, like night, the light being only such as enabled them to see each other and objects near them. Whereas the land of unrest, there were but wrangling and discontent and jealousy. Here there were fierce fights and bitter quarrels. Here were gamblers and drunkards, betting men, card sharpers, commercial swindlers, profligates, and thieves of every kind, from the thief of slums to his well-educated counterpart in the higher circles of earth life, all whose instincts were roguish or dissipated, all who were selfish and degraded in their tastes were here, as well as many who would have been in a higher condition of spiritual life had not constant association on earth with this class of men deteriorated and degraded them to the level of their companions, so that at death they had gravitated to this dark sphere, drawn down by ties of association. It was to this last class that I was sent, for amongst them there was a hope that all sense of goodness and right was not quenched, and that the voice of one crying to them in the wilderness of their despair might be heard and lead them back to a better land. The wretched houses or dwellings of this dark land of misery were many of them large, spacious places, but all stamped with the same appalling look of uncleanliness, foulness, and decay. They resembled large houses to be seen in some of our slums, once handsome mansions and fine palaces, the abodes of luxury, which have become the haunts of the low denizens of vice and crime. Here and there would be great lonely tracts of country, with a few scattered wretched houses, mere hovels, and in other places the buildings and the people were huddled together in great, gloomy, degraded-looking copies of your large cities of earth. Everywhere squalor and the dirt and wretchedness reigned. Nowhere was there one single bright or beautiful, gracious thing for the eye to rest upon in all this scene of desolation, made thus by the spiritual emanations from the dark beings who dwelt there. Amongst these wretched inhabitants, I wandered with my little star of pure light, so small that it was but a bright spark flickering about in the darkness as I moved. Yet around me it shed a soft, pale light, as from a star of hope that shone for those not too blinded by their own selfish, evil passions to behold it. Here and there I would come upon some crouched in a doorway or against a wall or in some miserable room who would arouse themselves sufficiently to look at me with my light and listen to the words I spoke to them, and would begin to see, for the better way, the returning path to those upper spheres from which they had fallen by their sins. Some I would be able to induce to join me in my work of helping others, but as a rule they could only think of their own miseries and long for something higher than their present surroundings, and even this, small as it seems, was one step, and the next one of thinking how to help others forward as well would soon follow. One day in my wanderings through this country, I came to the outskirts of a large city in the middle of a wide, desolate plain. The soil was black and arid, more like those great cinder heaps that are seen near your ironworks than anything I can liken it to. I was amongst a few dilapidated, tumble-down little cottages that formed a sort of fringe between the unhappy city and the desolate plain, when my ears caught the sound of a quarreling and shouting coming from one of them, and curiosity made me draw near to see what the dispute might be about, and if even here there might not be someone whom I could help.
It was more like a barn than a house. A great rough table ran the length of the room, and round it upon coarse little wooden stools were seated about a dozen or so of men. Such men! It is almost an insult to manhood to give them the name. They were more like orangutans, with the varieties of pigs and wolves and birds of prey expressed in their coarse, bloated, distorted features. Such faces, such misshapen bodies, such distorted limbs, I can in no way describe them. They were clothed in various grotesque and ragged semblances of their former earthly finery, some in the fashion of centuries ago, others in more modern garb, yet all alike ragged, dirty, and unkempt, the hair disheveled, the eyes wild and staring and glowing, now with the fierce light of passion, now with the sullen fire of despair and vindictive malice. To me, then, it seemed that I had reached the lowest pit of hell, but since then I have seen a region lower still, far blacker, far more horrible, inhabited by beings so much fiercer, so much lower, that beside them these were tame and human. Later on I shall describe more fully these lowest beings when I come to that part of my wanderings that took me into the kingdoms in the lowest hell. But the spirits whom I now saw fighting in this cottage were quarreling over a bag of coins that lay on the table. It had been found by one of them and then given to be gambled for by the whole party. The dispute seemed to be because each wanted to take possession of it himself without regard to the rights of anyone else at all. It was simply a question of the strongest, and already they were menacing each other in a violent fashion. The finder of the money, or rather the spiritual counterpart of our earthly money, was a young man, under 30 I should say, who still possessed the remains of good looks, and but for the marks that dissipation had planted on his face, would have seemed unfit for his present surroundings and degraded associates. He was arguing that the money was his, and though he had given it to be played for fairly, he objected to be robbed of it by anyone. I felt I had no business there, and amidst a wild chorus of indignant cries and protestations, they all supposed they were as well able to say what was honest as he was. I turned and left them. I had proceeded but a short way, and was almost opposite another deserted little hovel when the whole wild crew came struggling and fighting out of the cottage, wrestling with each other to get near the young man with the bag of money, whom the foremost of them were beating and kicking and trying to deprive of it. This one of them succeeded in doing, whereupon they all set upon him, while the young man broke away from them and began running towards me. In a moment there was a wild yell set up to catch him and beat him for an impostor and a cheat, since the bag was empty of gold and only had stones in it, the money, like the fairy golden stories, having turned not into withered leaves, but into hard stones. Almost before I realized it, the wretched young man was clutching hold of me and crying out to me to save him from those devils, and the whole lot were coming down upon us in hot pursuit of their victim. Quick as a thought, I sprang into the empty hovel which gave us the only hope of asylum. Dragging the unfortunate young man with me and slamming the door, I planted my back against it to keep our pursuers out. My goodness, how they did yell and stamp and storm and try to batter in the door, and how I did brace myself up and exert all the force of mind and body to keep them out. I did not know it then, but I know now that unseen powers helped me and held fast that door till, baffled and angry that they could not move it, they went off at last to seek for some fresh quarrel or excitement elsewhere. Chapter 7. The Story of Raoul. When they had gone, I turned to my companion, who sat huddled in a heap and almost stunned in one corner of the hut, and helping him to rise, I suggested that if he could make shift to walk a little, it would be well for both of us to leave the place in case those men should think fit to return. With much pain and trouble, I got him up and helped him slowly to a place of safety on the dark plain, where, if we were without shelter, we were at least free from the danger of being surrounded. Then I did my best to relieve his sufferings by methods I had learned during my stay in the House of Hope, and after a time the poor fellow was able to speak and tell me about himself and how he came to be in the dark country. He was, it seemed, but recently from earth life, having been shot by a man who was jealous of his attentions to his wife, and not without reason. The one redeeming feature about this poor spirit's story was that he, poor soul, did not feel any anger or desire for revenge upon the man who had hurried him out of life, but only sorrow and shame for it all. What had hurt him most, and had opened his eyes to his degradation, was the discovery that the woman for whose love it had all been done was so callous, so selfish, so devoid of all true sense of love for either of them, that she was only occupied in thinking how it would affect herself and her social position in the world of fashion, and not one thought, save of anger and annoyance, had she given to either her unhappy husband or the victim of his jealous anger. "When," said the young man, whom I should call Raoul, "when I knew that I was truly dead and yet possessed the power to return to earth again, my first thought was to fly to her and console her if possible, or at least make her feel that the dead yet lived, and that even in death I thought of her. And how do you think I found her? Weeping for me, sorrowing for him? No, not one atom, only thinking of herself and wishing she had never seen us, or that she could blot us both from her life by one coup de main, and begin life again with someone else higher in the social scale than either of us had been. The scales fell from my eyes, and I knew she had never loved me one particle. But I was rich. I was of the noblesse, and through my help she had hoped to climb another rung of the social ladder, and had willingly sunk herself into an adulteress, not for love of me, but to gain the petty triumph of queening it over some rival woman. I was nothing but a poor blind fool, and my life had paid the penalty of my folly. To her, I was but an unpleasant memory of the bitter shame and scandal that had fallen upon her. Then I fled from earth in my bitterness anywhere. I cared not where it was. I said I would believe no more in goodness or truth of any kind, and my wild thoughts and desires drew me down to this dark spot and these degraded revelers, amongst whom I found kindred spirits to those who had been my parasites and flatterers on earth, and amongst whom I had wasted my substance and lost my soul. "And now, O unhappy friend," I said, "would you not even now seek the path of repentance that would lead you back to the brighter lands and help you regain the lost inheritance of your manhood and your higher self?" "Now, alas, it is too late," said Raoul. "In hell, and surely this is hell, there is no longer hope for any." "No hope for any," I answered. "Say not so, my friend. Those words are heard all too often from the lips of unhappy souls, for I can testify that even in the darkest despair there is ever given hope. I, too, have known a sorrow and bitterness as deep as yours, yet I had ever hope, for she whom I loved was as the pure angels, and her hands were ever stretched out to give me love and hope, and for her sake I worked to give others the hope given to myself. Come, let me lead you, and I will guide you to that better land." "And who art thou, O friend, with the kind words and still kinder deeds, to whom in truth I might say I owed my life? But had I not learned that in this place, alas, one cannot die, one can suffer to the point of death, and even all its pains, yet death comes not to any, for we have passed beyond it, and it would seem must live through an eternity of suffering? Tell me who you are, and how you come to be here, speaking words of hope with such confidence. I might fancy you an angel sent down to help me, but that you resemble myself too much for that." Then I told him my history, and how I was working myself upwards, even as he might do, and also spoke of greater hope I had always before me, that in time I should be fit to join my sweet love in a land where we should be no more parted. "And she," he said, "is content, you think, to wait for you? She will spend her life lonely on earth that she may join you in heaven when you shall get there? Bah, mon ami, you deceive yourself. It is a mirage that you pursue. Unless she is either old or very plain, no woman will dream of living forever alone for your sake. She will for a time, I grant you, if she is romantic, or if no one come to woo her, but unless she is an angel, she will console herself by and by, believe me. If your hopes are no more well-founded, then I shall feel only sorry for you." I confess, his words angered me somewhat. They echoed the doubts that always haunted me, and were like a cold shower bath upon all the warmth of romance with which I had buoyed myself up. It was partly to satisfy my own doubts, as well as his, that I said with some heat, "If I take you to earth, and we find her mourning only for me, thinking only of me, will you believe me, then, that I know what I speak about, and am under no delusion? Will you admit that your experience of life, of women, may not apply to all, and that there is something that even you can learn on this as on other matters? My good friend, believe me that I ask your pardon with all my soul if my unbelief has pained you. I admire your faith, and would I could have but a little of it myself. By all means, let us go and see her." I took his hand, and then, willing intently that we should go to my beloved, we began to rise and rush through space with the speed of thought almost, till we found ourselves upon earth, standing in a room. I saw her guardian spirit watching over my beloved, and the dim outline of the room and its furniture, but my friend Raoul saw nothing but the form of my darling seated in her chair, and looking like some of the saints from the brightness of her spirit and the pale, soft aureole of light that surrounded her. A spiritual light invisible to you of earth, but seen by those on the spiritual side of life, around whose lives are good and pure, just as a dark mist surrounds those who are not good. "Mon Dieu!" cried Raoul, sinking upon his knees at her feet. "It is an angel, a saint you have brought me to see, not a woman. She is not of earth at all." Then I spoke to her by name, and she heard my voice, and her face brightened, and the sadness vanished from it, and she said softly, "My dearest, you are indeed there? I was longing for you to come again. I can think and dream of nothing but you. Can you touch me yet?" She put out her hand, and for one brief moment mine rested in it, but even that moment made her shiver as though icy wind had struck her. "See, my darling one, I have brought an unhappy friend to ask your prayers, and I would have him to know that there are some faithful women on earth, some true love to bless us with, were we but fit to enjoy it." She had not heard clearly all that I said, but her mind caught its sense, and she smiled so radiant a smile and said, "Oh, yes, I am ever faithful to you, my beloved, as you are to me, and some day we shall be so very, very happy." Then Raoul, who was still kneeling before her, held out his hand and tried to touch hers, but the invisible wall kept him away, as it had done me, and he drew back, crying out to her, "If your heart is so full of love and pity, spare some to me, who am indeed unhappy and need your prayers. Pray that I too may be helped, and I shall know your prayers are heard where mine were not worthy to be, and I shall hope that even for me pardon may yet be possible." My darling heard the words of this unhappy man, and kneeling down beside her chair, offered up a little simple prayer for help and comfort to us all. And Raoul was so touched, so softened, that he broke down completely, and I had to take him by the hand and lead him back to the spirit land, though not now to a region devoid of hope. From that time Raoul and I worked together for a little in the dark land he had now ceased to dwell in, and from day to day he grew more hopeful. By nature, he was most vivacious and buoyant, a true Frenchman, full of airy, graceful lightness of heart, which even the awful surroundings of that gloomy spot could not wholly extinguish. We became great friends, and our work was pleasanter from being shared. Our companionship was, however, not destined to last long then, but we have since met and worked together many times, like comrades in different regiments whom the chances of war may bring together or separate at any time. Chapter 8. Temptation. I was again called upon to go to earth upon a mission of help, and to leave for a time my wanderings in the spirit spheres. And now it was that the greatest and most terrible temptation of my life came to me. In the course of my work, I was brought across one still in the earth body whose influence over my earthly life had done more than aught else to wreck and spoil it. And though I also had not been blameless, far indeed from it, yet I could not but feel an intense bitterness and thirst for revenge whenever I thought of this person and all the wrongs that I had suffered. wrongs brooded over, till at times I felt as if my feelings must have vent in some wild burst of passionate resentment. In my wanderings upon the earth plane, I had learned many ways in which a spirit can still work mischief to those he hates who are yet in the flesh. Far more power is ours than you would dream of, but I feel it is wiser to let the veil rest still upon the possibilities the world holds even after death for a revengeful spirit. I could detail many terrible cases I know of as having actually taken place, mysterious murders and strange crimes committed, none knew why or how, by those on earth whose brains were so disordered that they were not themselves responsible for their actions, and were but the tools of a possessing spirit. These and many kindred things are known to us in the spirit spheres, where circumstances often wear a very different aspect from the one shown to you. The old beliefs in demonical possession were not so visionary after all. Only these demons or devils had themselves been once the denizens of earth. It so happened to me then that when I came once more, after long years of absence, across this person whom I so hated, all my old feelings of suffering and anger revived, but with tenfold more force than is possible in earth life, for a spirit has far, far greater capabilities of suffering or enjoyments, of pleasure or pain, love or hate, than one whose senses are still veiled and deadened by the earthly envelope, and thus all the senses of a disembodied spirit are tenfold more acute. Thus, when once more I found myself beside this person, the desire for my long-suspended revenge woke again, and with the desire a most devilish plan for its accomplishment suggested itself to me, for my desire of vengeance drew up to me from the haunts in the lowest hell, spirits of so black a hue, so awful a type, that never before had I seen such beings, or dreamed that out of some nightmare fable they could exist. These beings cannot live upon the earth plane, nor even in the lower spheres surrounding it, unless there be congenial mortals or some strong magnetic attraction to hold them there for a time. And though they often rise in response to an intensely evil desire on the part of either a mortal spirit on the earth plane, yet they cannot remain long, and the moment the attracting force becomes weakened, like a rope that breaks, they lose their hold and sink down again to their own dark abodes. At times of great popular indignation and anger, as in some great revolt of an oppressed people, in whom all sense but that of suffering and anger has been crushed out, the bitter wrath and thirst for revenge felt by the oppressed will draw around them such a cloud of these dark beings that horrors similar to those witnessed in the great French Revolution and kindred revolts of downtrodden people will take place, and the maddened populace are for a time completely under the control of those spirits who are truly as devils. In my case, these horrible beings crowded round me with delight, whispered in my ears, and pointed out a way of revenge so simple, so easy, and yet so horrible, so appalling in its wickedness, that I shall not venture to write it down, lest the idea of it might be given to some other desperate one, and like seed falling to a fruitful soil, bring forth its baleful blossoms. At any other time I should have shrunk back in horror from these beings and their foul suggestions. Now, in my mad passion, I welcomed them, and was about to invoke their aid to help me accomplish my vengeance, when like the tones of a silver bell there fell upon my ears the voice of my beloved, to whose pleadings I was never deaf, and whose tones could move me as none else could. The voice summoned me to come to her by all that we both held sacred, by all the vows we had made and all the hopes we had cherished. And though I could not so instantly abandon my revenge, yet I was drawn, as by a rope, to the one I loved from the one I hated. And the whole wild crew of black devils came with me, clinging to me and trying to hold me back, yet with an ever feebler hold as the voice of my love and purity and truth penetrated more and more deeply to my heart. And then I saw my beloved standing in her room, her arms stretched out to draw me to her, and two strong, bright spirit guardians by her side, while around her was drawn a circle of flaming silver light, as though a wall of lightning encircled her. Yet at her call I passed through it and stood at her side. The dark crowd sought to follow, but were kept back by the flaming ring. One of the boldest made a rush at me as I passed through and tried to catch hold, but his hand and arm were caught by the flame of light and shriveled up as though thrust into a furnace. With a yell of pain and rage, he drew back amidst a wild howl of derisive laughter from the rest. With all the power of her love, my darling pleaded with me that I should give up this terrible idea and promise her never more to yield so base a thought. She asked me if I loved my revenge so much better than I loved her, that to gratify it I would raise up between us the insurmountable barrier of my meditated crime. Was her love indeed so little to me after all? At first I could not yield, but at last she began to weep, and then my heart melted, as though her tears had been warm drops of her heart's blood, falling on it to thaw its ice. And in bitter anguish of soul that I should have caused her to shed tears, I knelt at her feet and prayed to be forgiven my wicked thought, prayed that I might still be left with her love to cheer me, still with her for my one thought, one hope, my all. And as I prayed, the circle of dark spirits who had been fighting to get in and beckoning to me, trying to draw me out, broke like a cloud of black mist when the wind scatters it, and they sank away down to their own abode again, while I sank exhausted at my darling's feet. At times after this, I saw the dark spirits draw near to me, though never again could they come close, for I had an armor in my darling's love and promise to her, which was proof against all their attacks. Chapter 9. The Frozen Land, the Caverns of Slumber. I was next sent to visit what will indeed seem a strange country to exist in the spirit world, the land of ice and snow, the frozen land, in which lived all those who had been cold and selfishly calculating in their earthly lives, those who had crushed out and chilled and frozen from their own lives and the lives of others all those warm, sweet impulses and affections which make the life of heart and soul. Love had been so crushed and killed by them that its sun could not shine where they were, and only the frost of life remained. Great statesmen were amongst those whom I saw dwelling in this land, but they were those who had not loved their country nor sought its good. Only their own ambitions, their own aggrandizement had been their aim, and to me they now appeared to dwell in great palaces of ice and on the lofty frozen pinnacles of their own ambitions. Others more humble and in different paths of life I saw, but all alike were chilled and frozen by the awful coldness and barrenness of a life from which all warmth, all passion was shut out. I had learned the evils of an excess of emotion and of passion. Now I saw the evils of their entire absence. Thank God this land had far fewer inhabitants than the other, for terrible as are the effects of misused love, they are not so hard to overcome as the absence of all tender feelings of the human heart. There were men here who had been prominent members of every religious faith and every nationality on your earth. Roman Catholic cardinals and priests of austere and pious but cold and selfish lives, Puritan preachers, Methodist ministers, Presbyterian divines, Church of England bishops and clergymen missionaries, Brahmin priests, Parsis, Egyptians, Mohammedans, in short, all sorts of nationalities were to be found in the frozen land, yet in scarcely one was there enough warmth of feeling to thaw ice around themselves, even in a small degree. When there was even a little tiny drop of warmth, such as one tear of sorrow, then ice began to melt, and there was hope for that poor soul. There was one man whom I saw who appeared to be enclosed in a cage of ice. The bars were of ice, yet they were as bars of polished steel for strength. This man had been one of the grand inquisitors of the Inquisition in Venice, and had been one of those whose very names sent terror to the heart of any unfortunate who fell into their clutches. A most celebrated name in history, yet in all the records of his life and acts, there was not one instance where one shade of pity for his victims had touched his heart and caused him to turn aside, even for one brief moment. from his awful determination in torturing and killing those whom the Inquisition got into its toils. A man known for his hard, austere life that had no more indulgence for himself than for others, cold and pitiless, he knew not what it was to feel one answering throb awake in his heart for another's sufferings. His face was a type of cold, unemotional cruelty. The long, thin, high nose, the pointed, sharp chin, the high, rather wide cheekbones, the thin, straight, cruel lips, like a thin line across the face, the head somewhat flat and wide over the ears, while the deep-set, penetrating eyes glittered from their penthouse brows with the cold, steely glitter of a wild beast's. Like a procession of specters, I saw the wraiths of some of this man's many victims glide past him, maimed and crushed, torn and bleeding from their tortures, pallid ghosts, wandering astral shades, from which the souls had departed forever, but which yet clung around this man, unable to decay into the elements, whilst his magnetism attached them, like a chain to him. The souls and all the higher elements had forever left those which were true astral shells, yet they possessed a certain amount of vitality. Only it was all drawn from this man, not from the released spirits which had once inhabited them. They were such things as those ghosts are made of, which are seen haunting the spot where someone too good and innocent to be so chained to earth has been murdered. They seem to their murderers and others to live and haunt them, yet the life of such astrals or ghosts is but a reflected one, and ceases as soon as remorse and repentance have sufficed to serve the tie that links them to their murderers. Other spirits I saw haunting this man and taunting him with his own helplessness and their past sufferings, but these were very different looking. They were more solid in appearance and possessed a power and strength and intelligence wanting in those other misty-looking shades. These were spirits whose astral forms still held the immortal souls imprisoned in them, though they had been so crushed and tortured that only the fierce desire of revenge remained. These spirits were incessant in their endeavor to get at their former oppressor and tear him to pieces, and the icy cage seemed to be regarded by him as being as much a protection from them as a prison for himself. One more clever than the rest had constructed a long, sharp-pointed pole, which he thrust through the bars to prod at the man with, and wonderful was the activity he displayed in trying to avoid its sharp point. Others had sharp javelins, which they hurled through the bars at him. Others, again, squirted foul, slimy water, and at times the whole crowd would combine in trying to hurl themselves en masse upon the sheltering bars to break through, but in vain. The wretched man within, whom long experience had taught the impregnability of his cage, would taunt them in return with a cold, crafty enjoyment of their fruitless efforts. To my mental query as to whether this man was ever released, an answer was given to me by that majestic spirit whose voice I had heard at rare times speaking to me from the time when I heard it first at my own grave. On various occasions when I had asked for help or knowledge, the spirit had spoken to me as now, from a distance, his voice sounding to me as the voice spoken of by the prophets of old when they thought the Lord spoke to them in the thunder. This voice rang in my ears with its full deep tones, yet neither the imprisoned spirit nor those haunting him heard it. Their ears were deaf so that they could not hear, and their eyes blind so they could not see. And to me the voice said, "Son, behold the thoughts of this man for one brief moment. See how he would use liberty were it his." And I saw, as one sees images reflected in a mirror, the mind of this man. First the thought that he could get free, and when once free he could force himself back to earth and the earth plane, and once there he could find some still in the flesh whose aspirations and ambitions were like his own, and through their help he would forge a still stronger yoke as of iron to rivet upon men's necks, and found a still crueler tyranny, a still more pitiless inquisition, if that were possible, which should crush out the last remnant of liberty left to its oppressed victims. He knew he would sway with power far greater than his earthly power, since he would work with the hands and brain freed from all earthly fetters, and he would be able to call up around him kindred spirits, fellow workers, with souls as cold and cruel as his own. He seemed to revel in the thought of the fresh oppressions he could plan, and took pride to himself in the recollection that he had ever listened unmoved to the shrieks and groans and prayers of the victims he had tortured to death. From the love of oppression and for his own relentless ambition he had worked, making the aggrandizement of his order but the pretext for his actions, and in no single atom of his hard soul was there awakened one spark of pity or remorse. Such a man set free to return to earth would be a source of danger far more deadly than the most fierce wild beast, since his powers would be far less limited. He did not know that his vaunted Inquisition, which he still sought to strengthen in all its deadly powers, had become a thing of the past, swept away from the face of God's earth by a power far mightier than he could wield, and that, like the dark and terrible age in which it had sprung up, like a noisome growth, it had gone never more to return, thank God, never again to disgrace humanity by the crimes committed in the name of him who came only to preach peace and love on earth. Gone, with its traces and its scars left yet upon the human mind, in its shaken and broken trust in a God and in immortality. The recoil of that movement which last swept away the Inquisition is yet felt on earth, and long years must pass before which all was good and pure and true had survived throughout even those dark ages, shall reassert its power and lead men back to their faith in a God of love, not a God of horrors, as those oppressors painted him. From this frozen land I turned away chilled and saddened. I did not care to linger there or explore its secrets, though it may be that again at some future time I may visit it. I felt that there was nothing I could do in that land, none I could understand, and they but froze and revolted me without my doing them any good. On my way back from the frozen land to the land of twilight, I passed a number of vast caverns called the Caverns of Slumber, wherein lay a great multitude of spirits in a state of complete stupor, unconscious of all around them. These, I learned, were the spirits of mortals who had killed themselves with opium eating and smoking, and whose spirits had thus been deprived of all chance of development, and so had retrograded instead of advancing and growing, just as a limb tied up and deprived of motion withers away, and now they were feebler than an unborn infant, and as little able to possess conscious life. In many cases, their sleep would last for centuries. In others, where the indulgence in the drug had been less, it might only last for 20, 50, or 100 years. These spirits lived, and that was all, their senses being little more developed than those of some fungus growth, which exists without one spark of intelligence. Yet in them the soul germ had lingered, imprisoned, like a tiny seed in the wrapping of some Egyptian mummy, which, long as it may lie thus, is yet alive, and will in a kindly soil sprout forth at last. These caverns, in which kind spirit hands had laid them, were full of life-giving magnetism, and a number of attendant spirits who had themselves passed through a similar state from opium poisoning in their own earth lives, were engaged in giving what life they could pour into those comatose spirit bodies which lay like rows of dead people all over the floor. By slow degrees, according as the spirit had been more or less injured by the drug taken in the earthly life, these wretched beings would awake to consciousness and all the sufferings experienced by the opium eater when deprived of his deadly drug. By long and slow degrees the poor spirits would awaken, sense by sense, till at last, like feeble, suffering children, they would become fit for instruction, when they would be sent to institutions like your idiot asylums, where the dawning intellect would be trained and helped to develop, and those faculties recovered which had been all but destroyed in earth life. These poor souls would only learn very slowly, because they had to try to learn now, without the aids of the earthly life, those lessons which it had been designed to teach. Like drunkards, only more completely, they had paralyzed the brain and senses, and had avoided, not learned, the lessons of earthly life and its development of the spirit. To me, these caves of slumber were inexpressibly sad to behold, not less so than those wretched slumberers were unconscious for so long of the valuable time they lost in their dreamless, hopeless sleep of stagnation. Like the hare in the fable, while they slept, others less swift won the race, and these poor souls might try in vain through countless ages to recover the time they had lost. When these slumberers shall at last awake, to what a fate do they not awaken? Through what an awful path they must not climb to reach again that point in the earth life from which they have fallen. Does it not fill our souls with horror to think that there are those on earth who live and pile up wealth through the profits made from that dreadful trade in opium, which not alone destroys the body, but would seem to destroy even more fatally the soul, till one would despondently ask if there be indeed hope for these victims? These terrible stupefied spirits, can any words point a fate more fearful than theirs? To awaken at last with the intellects of idiots, to grow through hundreds of years back at last to the possession of the mental powers of children, not grown men and women. Slow must be their development, even then, for unlike ordinary children, they have almost lost the power to grow, and take many generations of time to learn what one generation on earth could have taught them. I have heard it said that many of the unhappy beings, when they have attained at last to the development of infants, are sent back to earth to be reincarnated in an earthly body, that they may enjoy again the advantages they have misused before. But of this I only know by hearsay, and I cannot give any opinion of my own upon its truth. I only know that I should be glad to think of any such possibility for them that could shorten the process of development or help them to regain all that they had lost. Chapter 10. My House in the Twilight Lands, Communion between the Living and the Dead. In my home in the Twilight Land, I rested now for a time, studying to learn more of myself and the powers I had within me, and seeking to apply the lessons I had learned in my wanderings. My chief instructor at this time was a man like myself in many respects, who had lived a similar life on earth and had passed through the lower spheres, as I was now doing, and who had become a dweller in a bright land of sunshine, from which he came constantly to teach and help those of the brotherhood who, like myself, were his pupils. There was likewise another teacher, or guide, whom I sometimes saw, whose influence over me was even greater, and from whom I learned many strange things, but as he was in a much more advanced sphere than the other, it was but seldom that I could see him as a distinct personality. His teachings came to me more as mental suggestions or inspirational discourses in answer to some questioning thought on my part. This spirit I shall now describe to you, as at this time of my sojourn in the Twilight Land I saw him but very dimly, and only clearly when my progression had carried me into a brighter state. Though this man was not fully visible to me, I was often conscious of his presence and his aid. When later on I learned that he had been my principal guardian spirit during my earthly life, I could easily trace many thoughts and suggestions, many of my higher aspirations, to his influence, and it was his voice that had so often spoken to me in warning or comfort when I struggled on, almost overwhelmed with my terrible position on first entering the spirit world. In the days of darkness, I had been faintly conscious of his form flitting in and out of my little cell, and soothing my terrible sufferings with his magnetism and his wonderful knowledge and power. On returning to the Twilight Land from the darker spheres I had visited, I felt almost like returning to home, for, bare and shabby as my room looked, and small and narrow as it was, it yet held all my greatest treasures, my picture mirror in which I could see my beloved, and the rose and the letter she had sent to me. Moreover, I had friends there, companions in misfortune like myself, and though we were, as a rule, much alone, meditating upon our past mistakes and their lessons, yet at times it was very pleasant to have one friend or another come in to see you, and since we were all alike men who had disgraced ourselves by our earthly lives and were now seeking to follow the better way, there was, even in that, a bond of sympathy. Our life, could I make you fully realize it, would indeed seem strange to you. It was like and yet unlike an earthly life. For instance, we ate at times a simple sort of food provided for us. It would seem by magic whenever we felt hungry, but often for a week at a time we would not think of food, unless indeed it was one of us who had been fond of good eating on earth. The desire would be much more frequent and troublesome to satisfy. For myself, my tastes had been somewhat simple, and neither eating nor drinking had in themselves possessed special attractions for me. There was always around us this twilight, which was never varied with dark or bright day, and which was most especially trying to me in its monotony. I so love light and sunshine. To me it was ever as a life-giving bath. I had been born in a land of earth where all is sunshine and flowers. Then, although we usually walked about this building and the surrounding country much as you do, we could float a little at will, though not so well as more advanced spirits do. And if we were in a great hurry to go anywhere, our will seemed to carry us there with the speed almost of thought. As for sleep, we could spend long intervals without feeling its need, or, again, we could lie and sleep for weeks at a time, sometimes semi-conscious of all the past, at others in the most complete of slumbers. Another strange thing was our dress, which never seemed to wear out and renewed itself in a mysterious fashion. All through this period of my wanderings, and while I was in this abode, it was of a very dark blue color, with a yellow girdle round the waist, and an anchor worked in yellow on the left sleeve, with the words, "Hope is eternal," below it. There were close-fitting undergarments of the same dark color. The robe was long, and such as you see penitent brotherhoods or monks wear on earth, with a hood hung from the shoulders, which could be used to cover the head and face of any who desired to screen their features from view. And indeed there were often times when we wished to do so, for suffering and remorse had made such changes in us that we were often glad to hide our faces from the gaze of those we loved. The hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, wasted and bent forms, and deep lines suffering had traced upon each face told their own story but too well, and such of us as had dear friends on earth or in the spirit land still grieving for our loss sought often at times to hide from their eyes our disfigured forms and faces. Our lives had somewhat of monotony about them in the regular order in which our studies and our lectures followed each other like clockwork. At certain stages, for they did not count time by days or weeks, but only as advance was made in the development of each spirit, when a lesson had been learned in a longer or shorter time according to the spiritual and intellectual development, the spirit was advanced to a higher branch of the subject studied. Some remain a very long time before they can grasp the meaning of the lessons shown to them. If so, the spirit is in no way hurried or pressed on, as is done in earth education, where life seems all too short for learning. As a spirit, a man has all eternity before him and can stand still or go as he pleases, or he may remain where he is till he has thought out and grasped clearly what has been shown, and then he is ready for the next step, and so on. There is no hurrying anyone faster than he chooses to go, no interference with his liberty to live on in the same state of undevelopment if he wishes, so long as he interferes with the liberty of no one else and conforms to the simple rule which governs that great brotherhood, the rule of freedom and sympathy for all. None were urged to learn, and none were kept back from doing so. It was all voluntary, and did anyone seek, as many did, to leave this place, he was free to go where he would, and to return again if he wished. The doors were closed to none, either in going or returning, and none ever sought to reproach another with his faults or shortcomings, for each felt the full depth of his own. Some had been years there, I learned. For them, lessons were hard and slow to be learned. Others, again, had broken away and gone back to the life of the earth plane so many times they had descended to the lowest sphere at last, and gone through a course of purification in that house of hope where I had first been. They had appeared to go back instead of forward, yet even this had not been in truth a retrogression, but only a needful lesson, since they were thus cured of the desire to try the pleasures of the earth plane again. A few like myself, who had strong and powerful motive to rise, made rapid progress and soon passed on from step to step. But there were, alas, too many who required all the hope and all the help that could be given to sustain and comfort them through all their trials. And it was my lot to be able, out of the storehouse of my hopefulness, to give a share to others less fortunate who were not blessed, as I was, with a stream of love and sympathy flowing ever to me from my beloved on earth, cheering me on to fresh efforts with its promise of joy and peace at last. And now has given me a fresh source of happiness in being able to spend a certain time on earth with my darling when she was able to be made fully conscious that I was there. Many times I had been to see her unknown to herself. In all my wanderings I had found time to snatch brief happy moments to go to earth and look at her. And now, although I was still almost invisible to her eyes, yet she could tell that I was present and could feel my touch when I laid my hand on hers. She would place a chair for me beside her own, that we might sit side by side again, as in dear old days that were gone. She would speak to me, and could hear faintly what I said in answer, and could even distinguish dimly my form. Ah, the strangeness, the sadness, and yet the sweetness of those meetings between the living and the dead. I would come to her with my heart full of the bitterest anguish and remorse for the past. The sense of shame and humiliation at what I had become would be such that it seemed hopeless for one such as I was to rise to higher things, and the sight of her sweet face, and the knowledge that she believed in me and loved me in spite of all, would soothe my heart and give me fresh hope, fresh courage to struggle on. From that desolation of our lives there grew up in those strangely sweet meetings a trust and hope in the future that no words can describe. I learned that she had been developing her powers and studying how she could use the truly wonderful gifts which she possessed and which had lain dormant for so long, and she was greatly pleased to find out how well she was succeeding and how rapidly the curtain which shut me out from her was being drawn aside. There came to us another pleasure. My beloved had found a medium through whose peculiar organization it was made possible for a spirit to clothe himself again in the semblance of an earthly body, similar to an appearance to his own and recognizable by the friends he had left on earth. I was now enabled to materialize, as it is termed, a solid hand with which to touch her. Great was the happiness this gave us both, though I was as yet denied the further pleasure of showing myself to her. I was told I could not do so without bearing on the materialized face the traces of my sufferings, and it would only have pained her to see that. Later on, when I was more advanced, I should show myself clearly. Ah, now many poor spirits would come in crowds to those meetings, hoping for the chance that they too might be able to show themselves and win some recognition, see again someone who was glad to know that they still lived and could return. And how many were always certain to go away sad and disappointed because there were so many and only a certain amount of power, and those who were nearest and dearest were naturally granted a preference. The spirit world is full of lonely souls, all eager to return and show that they still live, still think of those whom they have left, still feel an interest in their struggles, and are as ready and often more able to advise and help than when they were on earth, were they not shut out by the barriers of the flesh. I have seen so very many spirits hanging about in the earth plane when they might have gone on to some bright sphere, but would not, because of their affection for some beloved ones left to struggle with the trials of earth and grieving in deepest sorrow for their death. And so the spirits would hang about them, hoping for some chance which would make the mortal conscious of their presence and their constant love. Could these but communicate as friends do on earth when one has to go to a distant country and leave the other behind, there would not be such hopelessness of sorrow as I have often seen. And although years and the ministrations of comforting angels will soften the grief of most mortals, yet would it not be a happier state for both mortals and spirits could they still but hold sweet communion together as of yore? I have known a mother whose son has taken to evil ways, and who believed that mother to be an angel in heaven far away. I have, I say, known her to follow her son for years, striving in pain to impress him with the sense of her presence, that she might warn and save him from his path of sin. I have seen one pair of lovers whom some misunderstanding had parted, and between whom death had placed a last insuperable barrier, haunt the beloved one left behind, and seek by all means in his power to convey to her the true state of things, and that their hearts had been ever true, whatever might have appeared to the contrary. I have seen spirits in such sorrow, such despair, trying in vain to win one conscious look, one single thought, to show that their presence was felt and understood. I have seen them in their despair cast themselves down before the mortal one and seek to hold her hand, her dress, anything, and the spirit hand was powerless to grasp the mortal one, and the mortal ears were deaf to the spirit voice. Only perhaps a sense of sorrow would be given, and an intense longing to behold again the dead, without power to know that the so-called dead was there beside them. There is no despair of earth, great as it often is, equal to the despair a spirit feels when first he realizes in all its force the meaning of the barrier which death has placed between him and the world of mortal man. Is it then wonderful that on the spirit side of life all means are being taken by those who seek to help and comfort the sorrowing ones, both on earth and in the spirit land, to roll back these barriers and to open wide the doors that men and angels may walk and talk together upon earth as in the days of old, when the world was but young? If there is much that is trivial, much that seems silly and foolish, and even vulgar or grotesque and terrible, in the manifestations witnessed through many mediums and in many circles, if there are fraudulent mediums and credulous fools, or vain and conceited egotists in the movement, is it not so with all great but unrecognized truths struggling for acknowledgement? And should not all these things be excused in view of the fact that they are all attempts, clumsy and foolish it may be, yet still attempts, to open the doors and let the light from the spirit world in upon a sorrowful earth? Find fault with these false or misdirected efforts if you will, but also seek for knowledge to direct them better, and you will help on those who are trying to climb to higher things, and do not try simply to sneer them down and crush and stifle them. Rather recognize them for what they are, the efforts of the unseen world to lift the veil that hides your beloved dead from your eyes. Chapter 11. Arinziman. To these meetings for materialization, I was always accompanied by that majestic spirit of whom I have already spoken, and whom I now knew by his name, Arinziman, the Eastern guide. As I was now beginning to see him more clearly, I will describe him to you. He was a tall, majestic-looking man with long, flowing white garments bordered with yellow, and a yellow girdle around his waist. His complexion was that of an Eastern, a pale, dusky tint. The features were straight and beautifully molded, as one sees them in the statues of Apollo, though their peculiar Eastern cast caused them to vary a little from the perfect Grecian type. His eyes were large, dark, soft, and tender as a woman's, yet with a latent fire and force of passion in their depths, which, though subdued and controlled by his strong will, yet gave a warmth and intensity to his looks and manner, from which I could easily believe that in his earth life he had known all the sweetness and all the passions of violent love and hate. Now his passions were purified from all earthly dross and served but as links of sympathy between him and those who, like myself, were still struggling to subdue their own lower natures and conquer their passions. A short, silky black beard covered his cheeks and chin, and his soft, wavy black hair hung somewhat long upon his shoulders. His figure, though tall and powerful, had all the litheness and supple grace of his Eastern race. For so marked are the types of each race that even the spirit bears still the impress of its earthly nationality, and although centuries had passed since Arinziman had left the earth body, he retained all the peculiarities which distinguished the Eastern from the Western people. The spirit was strangely like an earthly mortal man, and yet so unlike in that peculiar dazzling brightness of form and feature which no words can ever paint, nor pen describe, that strange and wonderful ethereality, and yet distinct tangibility, which only those who have seen the spirit of a higher sphere can truly understand. In his earth life, he had been a deep student of the occult sciences, and since his entry into the spirit world, he had expanded and increased his knowledge, till to me it seemed there was no limit to his powers. Like myself, of a warm and passionate nature, he had learned during long years of spirit life to overcome and subdue all his passions, till now stood up upon a pinnacle of power whence he stooped down ever to draw up strugglers like myself, whom his sympathy and ready understanding of our weaknesses made ready to receive his help, while one who had never himself fallen would have spoken to us in vain. With all his gentleness and ready sympathy, however, he had also a power of will, against which, when he chose to exert it, one sought in vain to fight, and I have beheld on more than one occasion some of the wild, passionate beings amongst whom he worked brought to a stop in something they were about to do, which would have harmed themselves or others. They would be spellbound and unable to move a limb, yet he had never touched them. It was but by his own powerful will, which was so much stronger than theirs, that for the time they were paralyzed. Then he would argue the matter with them kindly and frankly, and show them in some of his wonderful ways the full consequences to themselves and others of what they were about to do, and when he had done so, he would lift them from the spell of his will and leave them free to act as they desired, free to commit the meditated sin, now that they knew its consequences. And seldom have I known any who, after so solemn a warning, would still persist in following their own path. I myself have always been considered one whose will was strong, and who could not readily give it up to any others, but beside this spirit I have felt myself a child, and have bowed more than once to the force of his decisions. And here let me say that in all things in the spirit world man is free as air, to follow his own inclinations and desires if he wishes, and does not choose to take the advice offered to him. The limitations to a man's own indulgence and the extent to which he can infringe upon the rights of others are regulated by the amount of law and order existing in the sphere to which he belongs. For example, in the lowest sphere of all, where no law prevails but the law of the strongest oppressor, you may do what you please. You may injure or oppress another to the very last limits of his endurance, and those who are stronger than you will do the same to you. The most oppressed slaves on earth are less unhappy than those whom I have seen in the lowest sphere of all, where no law prevails, and where only those spirits are to be found who have defied all laws of God or man, and have been a law to themselves, exercising the most boundless oppression and wrong towards their neighbors. In those spheres which I shall shortly describe, it seems that strong, cruel, and oppressive as a spirit may be, there is always found someone still stronger to oppress him, someone still crueler, still wickeder, still more oppressive, till at last you arrive at those who may truly be said to reign in hell, kings and emperors of evil. And it goes on, until at last the very excess of evil will work its own cure. The worst and most tyrannical will long for some other state of things, some laws to restrain, some power to control, and that feeling will be the first step, the first desire for a better life, which will give the brothers of hope sent to work in those dark spheres the little loophole through which to give the idea of improvement and hope that it is still possible for them. As the spirit progresses upwards, there will be found in each circle of the ladder of progress an increased degree of law and order prevailing, to which he will be ready to conform himself, as he expects others to conform where the laws affect him. The perfect observance of the highest moral law is found in the highest spheres, but there are many degrees of observance, and he who respects the rights of others will find his rights respected, while he who tramples upon his neighbor will in turn be trampled upon by the stronger ones. In all respects, man in the spirit world is free to work or be idle, to do good or to do evil, to win a blessing or a curse. Such as he is, such will be his surroundings, and the sphere for which he is fitted must ever be the highest to which he can attain till his own efforts fit him to become a dweller in one higher. Thus, the good need no protection against evil in the spirit world. Their own different states place an insurmountable barrier between them. Those above can always descend at will to visit or help those below them, but between them and the lower spirits there is a great gulf that the lower ones cannot pass. Only upon your earth and on other planets where material life exists can there be the mixture of good and evil, influences with almost equal power. I say almost equal, since even on earth the good have the greater power, unless man shuts himself out from their aid by the indulgence of his lower passions. In the days of old, when men's hearts were simple as little children's, the spirit world lay close at their doors, and they knew it not. But now men have drifted far from it, and are likely mariners upon a raft, who are seeking now and again through the fog and mist to find it. Kind pilots of the spirit world are striving to guide and help them to reach that radiant land, that they may bring back a bright store of hope and light for the weary strugglers upon earth. Chapter 12. My Second Death. The meetings for materialization were held once a fortnight, and from the number of them I judged that about 3 months had passed when I was told by Arinzamon to prepare myself for a great change which was about to take place in myself and my surroundings, and which would mean my passing into a higher sphere. I have heard the spheres divided differently by different spirit teachers, and it is not very important that they should all be divided by the same standard, since these divisions are very similar to mapping out a country where the boundaries melt so imperceptibly into one another that it is not very essential to have the limits defined with perfect exactitude, since the changes in the countries and the people will of themselves mark their different states as you progress on your journey. Thus, then some will tell you that there are 7 spheres, and that the 7th means the heaven spoken of in the Bible. Others say there are 12 spheres. Others again extend the number. Each sphere is, however, divided into circles, usually 12 to a sphere, though here again some spirits will reckon them differently, just as your standards of measurement on earth differ in different countries, yet the thing they measure remains the same. For myself, I have been used to count that there are 7 spheres above the earth and 7 below it, using the terms above and below as signifying the nearness to or distance from the great central sun of our solar system, the nearest point of attraction towards that sun being considered to be our highest point of attainment, while in the limits of the earth spheres, and the farthest away being regarded as our lowest or most degraded sphere. Each sphere, then, being subdivided into 12 circles, which are blended so closely into each other that you appear to pass almost insensibly from one to the other. I had hitherto been in what is called the earth plane, which like a great broad belt circles around the earth and permeates its atmosphere. This earth plane may be said to comprehend within its bounds the first of the 7 spheres above and the first of those below the earth, and is used commonly in describing the habitations of those spirits who are said to be earthbound in a greater or lesser degree, because they are not able to sink below the earth attractions nor free themselves from its influences. I was now told that I had so far freed myself from the earth's attractions and overcome my desires for earthly things that I was able to pass into the 2nd sphere. The passing from the body of a lower sphere into that of a higher one is often, though not invariably, accomplished during a deep sleep, which closely resembles the death sleep of the spirit in leaving the earthly body. As a spirit grows more elevated, more etherealized, this change is accompanied by a greater degree of consciousness, till at last the passing from one high sphere to another is simply like changing one garb for another a little finer, discarding one spiritual envelope for a more ethereal one. Thus the soul passes onward, growing less and less earthly or material in its envelopment till it passes beyond the limits of our earth spheres into those of the solar systems. It happened then that upon my return from one of my visits to the earth, I felt overpowered by a strange, unusual sense of drowsiness, which was more like paralysis of the brain than sleep. I retired to my little room in the twilight land and, throwing myself upon my couch, sank at once into a profound, dreamless slumber like unto the unconscious sleep of death. In this state of unconsciousness I lay for about 2 weeks of earthly time, and during it my soul passed from the disfigured astral body and came forth like a newborn child, clothed in a brighter, purer, spiritual envelope which my efforts at overcoming the evil in myself had created for it. Only I was not born as an infant, but as a full-grown man, even as my experience and knowledge had been those of a mature spirit. There are some mortals whose knowledge of life is so limited, whose minds have been so little cultivated, and whose natures are so simple and childlike, that they are born into the spirit world as mere children, however many years of earthly life they may have known. But it was not so with me, and in assuming my new condition, I also possessed the development in age which my earth life had given me. In a state of perfect unconsciousness, my newborn soul was borne by the attendant spirit friends into the 2nd sphere, where I lay sleeping my dreamless sleep till the time came for my awakening. The discarded astral envelope I had left was, by the power of attendant spirits, dissolved into the elements of the earth plane, even as my earthly body left at my first death would decay into the earthly material from which it had been taken, dust returning unto dust again, while the immortal soul passed on to a higher state. Thus did I pass through my 2nd death and awake to the resurrection of my higher self.